You on the morrow. At. Grandmother. It appears that I need both a man I can trust to deliver a message and get to Riverrun in one piece and a man to command our forces, she murmured. Unless I cut you in two, I cannot do so with the family we currently have in Highgarden. I need Randil Tali. Garland did not speak for a moment. Then he nodded once, sharply. Is this about Margaery and Willers? A child of Rhaegar has made himself known, one which Ned Stark has kept hidden. Garland's eyebrows rose and then he murmured. I see. Margaery. Willers. Are they returning home? Were made aware before I was, she acknowledged, her voice bland. Your sister has been wed in a manner befitting of her. Your brother supported the match. Laura's. She shook her head slightly. Garland flinched, a tiny gesture, but one she caught, nonetheless. As I said last night, Stannis Baratheon has declared for himself. I would hope that Renly would be smart enough to sit out the coming wars, but he is foolish and if the rumors are to be believed is going to try and make his own claim. Either way, Stannis and Renly cannot hope to win. The North will have the Riverlands and the Reach then, Garland said, moving to stand next to her and staring out the window. She mirrored his gesture. A winning side, grandmother. If all goes to plan. What do you need from me? I need you to bring Randil Tali here. I will offer him a match between Talar and Willers, one I am sure he will accept. In return, he will help your father lead the Reach in the coming war. And if they are bound by a betrothal and later a match, then no one can think father weak if Lord Tali leads our troops. He would be family. She inclined her head. And me. When Lord Tali has agreed to my offer, you will ride north, to Riverrun. There you will wait for your good brother, Lord Robb, Lord Stark, and our future king. When they arrive at Riverrun, you write to me, and I will instruct Lord Paxter to sail for King's Landing. There they will meet the Northern Fleet, she said. Then she turned her head to look at him straight on and murmured, you will also tell Ned Stark something, which cannot be shared with the future king or with Lord Robb. Once you have his response, you will write to tell me yes or no. Nothing more. And I shall act accordingly. ****. Garland was gone within the hour. She watched, emotions swirling inside her as he galloped away from Highgarden and down the Rose Road before looping off in the direction of Horn Hill. She broke her fast slowly on some fruit and a cold cup of tea as she waited for her next visitor. Her eyes flicked to the window and, when she realized the sun had now nearly fully risen on the horizon, she sighed. He would be here soon. Mother. Where have you sent Garland? First Willers and Margaery, now Garland. This must stop. Mace half yelled not a minute later as he burst into her solar. She did not look up from her cup of tea as she snapped, take a seat. I shall not. You shall tell me what is going on, mother. In her peripheral vision she could see Mace flapping his hands up and down as though he wished to take flight and join the birds outside. She did not raise her eyes properly though and, eventually, he pulled out the chair opposite her and threw himself down like the child he was. Where is Aeleri? She asked, finally raising her eyes to look at him and realizing that Aeleri was not with him. In the feast hall. She tutted. And you did not think that your wife may wish to hear about her children? Mace spluttered for a moment, eyes going wide, and then he sighed. I shall go and fetch her. She did not reply, instead she pushed her empty bowl and cup away from her and turned her attention to writing a letter to Willers using the time and silence that Mace's departure gave her to finally put pen to paper. She had only just sealed the wax on the scroll when Aeleri knocked on the door, opened it and entered, Mace trailing behind her like an errant child who had been thoroughly put in his place. You wished to talk about the children, Olenna. Have a seat, Aeleri, she said, glancing up slightly as she carefully put the sealed scroll to one side. Once the woman had sat down and Mace had pulled up another chair and stropped into it, Olenna finally gave them both her attention. As we discussed before, she began, seeing no reason to not pretend her and Aeleri had conspired between Mace's back. Margaery has wed Robb Stark. Willers has sent an update. The Northern Army march south, they will link up with the Riverlands and from there meet our troops and press on to King's Landing. We will send as many men as Paxter believes is reasonable to the Arbor. Once we have received word, our ships will sail to King's Landing to blockade it with the Marndaeli ships. What is Ned Stark thinking? Mace spluttered out. Then he froze. Mother, you said our army would meet the northern one and press on to King's Landing. Surely you cannot think to tie us into this northern foolishness. What marriage? It appears, Aelari, she said, ignoring Mace completely, that the boy is the true-born child of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen. You understand what this means, I expect. Aelari jerked her head in a sharp nod. Margaery. I have not yet received word, she replied, her voice more gentle than before. I imagine she is too embarrassed to write for the moment. She likely thinks we will be angry over what she had done and the choice the forced will us to make. And are we angry? Frustrated, she bit out. Foolish girl. But if she is happy, then I suppose we should be happy. And, as I said, I imagine Tyrell blood will find its way onto the throne eventually. I would have preferred it be through a child of Margaery's, but a grandchild, there are worse options. She heaved out a sigh and glanced at Mace. Garland has gone to fetch Randall Tarly. They will be here by tomorrow night. When he arrives, we will offer a betrothal of his daughter to Willers, and then together you will lead our troops north, Mace. Garland will ride ahead of you and let the northern armies know of our plans. They are too sensitive to put in ravens anymore. She glanced at Aelari, raising her eyebrow questioningly as Mace began to open his mouth, likely to parrot more foolish nonsense. Aelari seemed to sigh quietly to herself, but then she nodded. Olenna watched as her good daughter rose to her feet and gently hauled a still spluttering Mace to his feet and carefully began to tug him out of the room. Come, Mace. Let us talk in our chambers, Olenna is very busy. Interlude, 298 AC, Aemon Targaryen. Have you ever loved someone and yet hated them at the same time, uncle? Jon asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them as they digested their evening meal and basked in the warmth of the fire. He inclined his head, turning slightly to look at his nephew. Jon was looking at him, eyes wide and a vulnerable expression on his face. It was that expression, so open and so desperate to receive assurances that he was not alone in his feelings, that made Aemon speak. My brother, Aerion. I hated him as much as I loved him. What did you do? Some men are truly evil, nephew, he whispered. They are beyond redemption. They are so twisted and so full of hate and disgust for everything and everyone that even when an open hand is offered, they would rather bite it off than take what is on offer. As much as I wish I could tell you that there is good in every man, you just have to find it, that is not the case. Some men are beyond redemption. Beyond hope. Beyond saving. Yet we must try. Did you try with Aerion? Every day, he replied. Every day. From the moment I was old enough to understand that he was sick, I tried. Yet each and every time, he rebuffed my open hand more and more harshly. He threatened to kill me, multiple times. He once said he would feed me to the dragonment and that, if I was a true Targaryen, I would rise again as a dragon. He used to torment Egg and my sisters. He once told Mother he did not love her and that she was weak. He bullied the servants and the small folk. I do not think there has ever been a man as feared and as loathed as Aerion was. Not even my grandfather. Your grandmother was a different sort of cruel, and the minds of people are short. They forget that there was worse in House Targaryen's history than Aerys. They also forget there was better. And you still loved him? Jon asked, his voice quiet and wobbly, as though afraid of the answer. Despite everything, you still loved him. Of course I loved him, he murmured, looking away from Jon and gazing into the flames. He was cruel to everyone and everything he ever met. He humiliated me as a boy and Egg as a man. He did not even shed a tear when my mother died. But he was family, Jon. There are things we will forgive our family for that we cannot countenance forgiving in others. He did things that shocked and repulsed me. That horrified my mother and father. He did things that, had he been anyone else, would have gotten him killed, and rightly so. Sometimes I saw slithers of good in him. I saw the way he held Daela in his arms when she was but a babe. I saw the way he tended for his Egg. I saw him smile when he was happy and laugh with joy, and not the sort of joy that came from the suffering of others but because he was truly happy, for the right reason. But Daeron never spoke true when he said that Aerion was a monster. Although he was my brother, he was a monster. As I said, I hated him as much as I loved him. For Arion, the good never outweighed the bad. As I said before, I mourn for him as much as I do for all my siblings. In some ways I mourn for him more, I mourn for the man he could have been. Despite everything, despite all the pain he caused my family, my mother, my father, my brothers, my sisters, and the pain he caused me, it did not stop me loving him. Chapter 20, Promise. Chapter text. Summary: Jon, the Northern Lords, Stannis, Davos and Maester Cressen have the same conversation in different ways, at different points of time and with different people. Olenna likewise has the same conversation and ponders on how to handle her infestation problem. In our interlude, Jon and Aemon discuss death. Notes: 1. Where the language in that line is from the books. There are lots of discussions of strategy in this chapter. It does not necessarily mean that things will play out any particular way. No one really knows about winter yet. Oberyn is prancing around being shifty, who knows what Varys is up to, and the Vale is still very much in play. 298 AC, Jon Snow. It took 2 weeks for Winter to reunite with the Northern Army, by which point the troops had reached Moat Cailin. She circled 4 times before she landed on the southern side of the ruined keep. No one rode out to meet him. Once he slid off Winter's back and had sent her off to hunt and then to take refuge at Greywater Watch until they were through the neck, he turned his attention back to the keep and began to make his way up the rotting causeway towards where men were beginning to gather as they waited his arrival. As he walked towards the gathered men, he could not help but grin as a big white blur appeared from behind them and broke through the ranks and charged at him. He kept walking, picking up his pace, until Ghost careened into him, sending them both staggering slightly. "I missed you too," he murmured as Ghost jabbed his muzzle forcefully into his side. "She's gone to Hojan and Mira, if you wish to join her." Ghost gave him one of those looks that made him feel as though his friend understood every word he had spoken. Then the direwolf huffed out a snort and turned back towards Moat Cailin, a spring in his step. "I will be glad of your company," he said quietly, running his hand along the direwolf's back as they walked together closer to the crumbling castle. It did not take them long to reach the drawbridge of Moat Cailin, and for the faces of the men at the front of the gathered group to be close enough that he could find familiarity in them. "Your Grace," Robb called, his voice teasing and light, once Jon was close enough. "By the gods, I think Winter is bigger than when we last saw her." The men were worried. He raised an eyebrow and turned slightly to watch Winter as she drew further and further away. He squinted slightly at her retreating form and realized, yes, Robb was right, she was bigger than she had been when his brother had last seen her. He turned back to his brother. "Do not let her hear you say that. I am sure she understands every word we speak." Robb barked out a laugh. "Come, Father and most of the lords have gathered for the evening meal. Stew. Stew." He grimaced slightly but threw his arm over his brother's shoulder as he finally drew level with the troops. "And the men? Have they eaten?" he asked, half turning to the dozen men who had been watching the southern side of the moat. "Aye, Your Grace," one replied. "Marndaeli men released us so we might eat a while ago." He nodded. "And your shift?" "Until the night settles fully. Another 12 men will watch the causeway overnight." "Good." Together he and Robb headed further into the ruins of the moat. "Only 12 men?" he asked quietly as they moved between pitched tents. "Father wants as few men on watch as possible until we are through the moat. Standing keeps men awake hours after they have finished their watch and they end up tired and make mistakes, he believes," Robb murmured. "We will soon need 100 men patrolling our camps at night. Better that the men are well rested before that happens." "That makes sense," he allowed, smiling softly to himself. "I had not thought of that. And of course, with Lord Reed and his men in the neck, we are unlikely to suffer from any attacks." Robb replied. They stopped near a huge vat of stew where men were carefully portioning up bowls for soldiers who were forming an orderly line. Once they had 2 full bowls, Robb turned and led Jon in the direction of where he had found Howland Reed and his men lurking in the darkness all those moons ago. He could not help but raise an eyebrow in surprise as he realized the partially collapsed timber frame had been removed and a door fashioned out of some wooden planks strung together. "Lord Marndaelis' men have certainly been busy," he remarked, as Robb pushed the makeshift door open. "I said they were bored rigid when we arrived. They have been doing what they can to fix up parts of the castle to make it livable. Masons and builders, they are not, but their efforts have been remarkable, Robb said, turning to grin at him. They turned the Great Hall into their quarters. For defensive reasons they thought better to stay together. He went to open his mouth but stopped as they crossed the threshold and entered the room. His eyes skimmed over the roof, which although still had huge holes in it, had begun to be fixed. Planks lay in mismatched pieces over some of the smaller holes and the walls. There was still a huge gap in the wall opposite the main door that led to the courtyard, and when he squinted, he could make out marshland beyond, but much of the room appeared to be in reasonable condition. It was almost certainly a far cry from what it had been a few moons before. In the far corner of the room, in the most secure-looking area, bedding had been thrown over the cots that the commanders would sleep in. Nearby a huge round stone, nearly the size of Winter, acted as a table with dozens of smaller stone pieces around it acting as seating. On those makeshift chairs sat half the lords of the north who were yet to realize they had company. No tents. Why bother? Robb replied. The roof over there keeps the draft out, so we just needed the cots. We'll only be here 2 nights, father thinks, just whilst we take stock, so no need to unpack all the wagons. And the rest of the men? Camped either in the other inhabitable rooms or in the courtyard outside. Any news from Margaery? He asked, glancing at his brother as they crossed the room. Robb flushed and shot him an unimpressed look. She said she would write to Riverrun. I hope it is good news, he replied quietly. As do I. He was spared answering as the Northern Lords finally realized that he and Robb had arrived. There was a burst of activity as more rocks were dragged around the makeshift table so that they could be seated, and then he fell into easy conversation with Lord Glover and Lord Umber. His eyes flicked, several times, to the map in the middle of the makeshift table several times before he began eating. How was the war, Your Grace? Lord Umber asked, eyes fixed on his food and tone careful as though he was not bothered by the answer but was instead making conversation. Concerning, he replied. When Lord Umber's face snapped up to him, he continued, my uncle Benjen has gone beyond the wall alone. Several of their most experienced rangers have been missing for several moons. There are more reports of wildlings moving south every day. He means to find out if the 2 incidents are linked. Alone. Joe Mormont must finally have gone mad, Lord Glover muttered, stabbing a piece of mutton. He shook his head. No. The men there reported that Lord Commander Mormont and my uncle argued about it. Uncle Benjen did not want to risk more Night's Watch men. A lone man can move more easily in hostile territory than a group. Lord Umber finally said, his face more pensive than Jon had ever seen it. And Benjen Stark has been First Ranger for a dozen years or more. He knows what he's doing. Smalljon went back to Last Hearth, did he not? Lord Glover said, his fork suspended slightly over his bowl. Aye. There was a brief pause whilst Lord Glover stabbed another piece of mutton and chewed on it. Good. You'll forgive me for saying it, Your Grace, but best not to leave the north undefended whilst we march south for your fucking throne. And there I was, Galbert, thinking that you marched south because you wanted to stick your sword up Tywin Lannister's ass, Mage Mormont barked out from across the table. It's all you've gobbed on about for the last few weeks. That's the second thing I want to do. He laughed. I shall take the compliment that crowning me is more important than shoving your sword up Tywin Lannister. Aye, you should, Lord Glover replied, raising his mug of ale and, when Jon raised his, smashing the 2 mugs together so the ale sloshed all over the table. They drank deeply and, once they were done, shared a wide smile. So where do we go now, Your Grace? Lord Umber said once most of the lords present had pushed their mugs and bowls away. I am to go to Gulltown, he began once he had swallowed his final mouthful of stew. I will write and offer to meet a representative of Lord Stan. Hisses left the mouths of the northern lords as his words, cutting across the last of his sentence. Once they had subsided, he continued, Lord Stannis cannot win the wars to come. He does not have the army, nor the ships, nor the food supplies, nor the people. Half his ships belong to old Valyrian houses who will declare for me when they realize that father's letters spoke true. It's a risk, father said quietly from his place across the table. He might send more men than you alone can handle. He will not know it is me going, he replied. I will tell him that a representative of mine will attend. Then why must you go at all, brother? Send me or Great Jon. Because I want Stannis man to see Winter and I together. He watched as, opposite him, Rob's eyes slid closed and his brother sighed. You want him to report back that your claim is true, and you are who you say you are. Your Stark looks are obvious. If you go with Winter, whoever he sends will realize that not only are you a Targaryen, and so Lord Stannis will likely lose much of his support, but you are a Stark and that you will have the support of the Riverlands and the North. And word will trickle south soon of your wedding to Lady Margaery. He will realize I have the winning hand, he replied. A representative can only speak the words I say. They cannot prove them. He will send Sir Davos Seaworth, father said, once again breaking the heavy silence. I agree, Wendell Martindale murmured. He is Stannis' most loyal man, and if you convince him that Lord Stannis cannot win, then you have won half the fight already. The Onion Knight. Great Jon barked out. Surely you jest, Wendell. Wendell shook his head forcefully. Every time I have been to King's Landing over the last few years when Lord Stannis has been there, the Onion Knight has not been far behind. Stannis trusts his word and his actions. He saved Lord Stannis' life during the rebellion, he murmured quietly. It makes sense that there is not a man that Lord Stannis would trust more. That sort of loyalty is hard to come by. What will you do then, Your Grace? Roose Bolton asked once it became clear no one would speak. What if this Sir Davos does not agree to your terms? He won't agree to any of my terms, he replied. He took a final swig of ale and then sighed. He will listen to what I have to say, he will offer me Lord Stannis' terms. And then we will part ways. Seems a pointless fucking trip, Great Jon remarked. No offense intended, Your Grace. He grimaced. It is a risk, he acknowledged. But I cannot see a man of Lord Stannis trying to kill me in Gulltown. His men respect him too much to act against orders, and I cannot see Lord Stannis ordering the death of any negotiator I send. But he might order your death, Robb muttered. I will have Winter though, and only a fool would meet a dragon on the open field, he replied. Besides, if Lord Stannis rejects my offer and tries to take King's Landing, which a smart man would, given the Lannister armies are reportedly the Riverlands and in the Westerlands, then he will end up trapped there. He will need all his men to defend King's Landing. Our armies are more than a match for the Lannister troops. Once we had taken the Westerlands, we would turn our attention to King's Landing, and with our ships, our grain and our men, we could siege the city for as long as necessary. Stannis has held against the siege of Storm's End for a year, Lord Glover remarked. He's a tough bastard. You won't get him out of there. I won't need to. Holding out against a siege with men who trust you and have vowed to die for you is very different to holding a city with 500,000 people, or more, who have no love for House Baratheon and who do not wish to see their children starve. They would turn on him the moment they began to grow hungry, father agreed. None of the noble houses are loved by the small folk, and Robert did much damage to the city during his rule, he neglected it. So if he takes King's Landing, it works in our favor, he replied. And if he does not take King's Landing and instead tries to meet us on the battlefield, he will lose. And if he hides on Dragonstone, we will root him out. Winter grows by the day and her fire grows hotter and her flames last longer. His ranks would crumble against her. And even without her, his numbers are dwarfed by ours. No matter how good a commander he is, he cannot win. What if he waits for us to beat back the Lannister armies and then meets us on the battlefield? What if he secures the houses that have declared for his brother? Robb asked, his eyes moving over the map spread across the middle of the table. The numbers are still in our favor. It would be harder, but we could do it. House Lannister has likely 50 to 60,000 men, closer to 60,000, I believe. Lord Stannis has, mayhaps, 6,000 men. Lord Renly has 10,000. We have 12,000 Northmen, excluding those who will remain in the north or crew our ships, likely 15 to 20,000 Riverlands men, and close to 80,000 Reach men, again, excluding those who will need to crew the Red Wine fleet. That is a cautious estimate on the Riverlands numbers, Mage Mormont replied. I had thought it numbered closer to 40,000. I am not counting free men nor the men who we may need to help with the harvest. House Free is Lord Tully's bannermen, why would we not count them? They will join us at the Twins if they have not already marched. The late Lord Free, he returned. We will not cross at the Twins. We will be marching down the King's Road to the crossroads. It would be faster to go through the twins, Lord Glover said, leaning forwards and shoving his bowl aside so he could run his hand down the map. Although if the King's Road is good repair, mayhaps only a week or so faster. I do not have the time, nor the patience, to barter with Lord Free, he replied. And Winter and I do not have the time to fly over the Riverlands on our return from Gulltown to hunt down the Northern Army. Going down the King's Road is easiest. Seems foolish to march down the King's Road then turn off down the River Road, only to march back again a few moons later, Lord Glover said. Aye, it does, doesn't it? He agreed mildly, unable to stop the smile sliding onto his lips. Particularly when Riverrun is reportedly under siege, the Riverlands army scattered, and their most strategic keeps taken. A smart man would secure King's Landing first if they were marching down the King's Road and then look to sort out the mess in the Riverlands. And if Lord Tywine decides to send his forces up the King's Road to meet us? Lord Sewin asked, speaking for the first time, his voice as soft as ever. Because that is what I would do. If I were Tywine Lannister, I would march the full might of my forces as fast as I could down the River Road and up the King's Road before the northern forces swelled too much, and I would kill us all before we even reached the Crossroads Inn. He smiled at the man. By the gods, Lord Umber breathed. That is what you want him to do, isn't it? You crazy bastard. ***. Later that night, he stood about 50 feet away from Moat Cailin on the causeway with his father and Ghost. They had not spoken for an age, but instead both had their gazes fixed on the darkening sky around them and the tree line that signaled the start of the neck. You changed plans since you left Winterfell, father said eventually. I take it that is why you wished to speak to me here. Aye, he replied. Uncle Eamon and I discussed our plans. He had views. He thought it put the Reach at risk. He does not trust House Free and I trust him. He believes we should march as though we plan to head straight to King's Landing and then turn back toward Riverrun. It will not take much longer, but it will make the Lannisters scramble if they believe we first mean to march on King's Landing. They will assume, like the Riverlands lords will, that we will be crossing at the Twins, thereby either withdrawing them from the Riverlands and channeling them down the Gold Road instead, or as fast as they can to King's Landing down the River Road, father agreed. Tywine will want to get to his children and grandchildren quickly. Although he may decide to come up the King's Road and meet us, as you wish him to do. He will not do that though. House Lannister has already proven to be unable to take care of itself. He will not want to run the risk of leaving King's Landing defenseless, and soon, Westeros will know I have the Reach. He will want to do all he can to reach King's Landing first. Hopefully by the time he receives news that the Northern Army does not mean to march on King's Landing, he will be halfway down either road, but I presume he will use the Gold Road, which runs through the north of the Reach, where Olenna will tell Mace to send the armies, his father replied, his voice soft. You mean to trap Tywine between the armies unless he does as you hope? Lady Olenna is smart. She will have her own spies reporting on our actions, and she will realize what it is we plan to do. What do you need from me? Scouts. Send 5 men to scout the Twins. And send 5 men for every 5 days ride ahead of the army. Make sure they know where we are going. Lord Hoster and Lord Edmure will not be happy that we are delayed by a week or more. We have already delayed. Truly I do not care, he replied. They should have had more than enough men to protect their own borders for as long as is necessary. Regardless of what Lady Catelyn did, their incompetency thus far is of their own making. Father regarded him carefully for a moment. Very well. Where will you go once you have been to Gulltown? There are reports that Tywine's men have taken Harrenhal, he said eventually. You mean to liberate it? I mean to repay House Went for the debt that I owe them. His father did not speak for a moment. Lady Shella is the last of her line and Harrenhal is too big to be ruled properly. It does not matter. Silence settled over them again. Ghost shifted slightly next to Jon and leaned heavily against him. He reached down and ran his fingers through the tufty fur at the top of High Direwolf's head. Some will think that you do not wish the army to go straight to Riverrun because of Lady Catelyn and her treatment of you. I know. You do not care. I think they are fools, he replied frankly. The Riverlands is currently lost to us. Walder Free will have aligned with House Lannister by now, or at least be considering it, for he has never backed a losing side, and right now we are the losing side. No one knows for sure yet about the Reach. Rumors have likely not gotten that far south yet, and they do not know about winter. Walder Free is a coward. And I will not have you barter with my siblings' futures to cross his damned bridge. It would not come to that. Yes, it would, because he thinks we need him to get to Riverrun as soon as we can. Our negotiating position with him is not strong. We march south, we relieve the siege of Harrenhal, and do not speak to me of how hard it will be. I know it will be hard, and then we march onwards into the Riverlands, pushing back the Lannisters one keep and one castle at a time. Then, if Tywin and his men have done as I think they will do and retreat to go down the Gold Road, we pin them between us and the Reach. If he has not and has instead retreated into the Westerlands, we root him out. And if he has gone to King's Landing, that will also not be a problem, not with winter, and likewise if he decides to come north. It is a good plan. I am not faulting it, Jon. Only that it will not be well received by the Riverlands lords. I will reunite with the army before we reach Harrenhal, he said, ignoring his father's comments. You will need to march swiftly, but not so swiftly the men are fatigued, and that I cannot reach you before Lord Tywin does, should he decide to come north. And Lord Stannis. If he does not agree to your terms, then we fight him once we are done with House Lannister. And if he does, he will take his men to Maidenpool and hold it. Given its location, it will not be long before it is sacked. Very well. You disagree? Father shook his head. No, he said quietly. Then father turned his eyes away from the causeway and turned to look at Jon. I think your arguments are sound and your rationale well thought out. You have learned more from Maester Aemon than I would have thought possible. I only wish that you had had years to get to know him and not moons. If I had years with Uncle Aemon, I would have had less time with you, father, he replied. Whatever frustration and resentment I have felt towards you, it does not mean I would have changed my past. Nor my life at Winterfell. He watched as his father lifted his hand and then placed it gently on his shoulder. There is something else on your mind. You did not bring me out here just to tell me this, or else you would have asked Robb to join us. You can ask or tell me anything, son. He did not speak for a moment and cast his gaze around to avoid looking at his father. Eventually, once he had found his strength, he looked up to meet his father's eyes. All my life I wanted to be a Stark. It was all I wanted. I would go to bed and think about it and wake up the next day and think about it. Oh, I wished to know who my mother was and if she was alive and if she loved me or if she even cared, but it was being a Stark that mattered. He stopped talking and sucked in a deep breath. I said I was more Snow than Targaryen, but that is not true. I am more Stark than I am Targaryen. I might be Rhaegar's child and I might have Winter and Uncle Aemon, but I was raised as your son. I was raised with my brothers and sisters, I was raised a Stark. I said you named me Jon and it kept me safe and that my true name made no difference, but that is not true. It might make no difference to me. I am your son, I will always be your son, but, if I am to take this throne, I need to know what my name was. Not because I do not wish to be a Stark anymore. Not because it changes anything for me. And I truly do not wish to know what my life could have been like had my mother lived, but I need to know so I can claim the throne as a Targaryen. I cannot claim it as a Stark. Father did not speak for a moment, but when he did his voice was rougher than Jon had ever heard it before. He pulled Jon firmly against him and pressed Jon's head against his shoulder as he whispered, You are my son. 298 AC, Davos Seaworth. None of the kingdoms have declared for me. He glanced away from the island of Dragonstone on the painted table and towards where Stannis stood. He cast his eyes over the man, noticing the furrow of his brow and tightness of his mouth, and onto the Red Woman. She was stood next to Stannis, as always, relaxed and assured, as though all her plans were going exactly as she had hoped. Her manipulation and influence over Stannis had started slowly, with his wife, before it had begun to engulf the man himself. There were times, particularly in recent weeks and following the death of Robert Baratheon, where Stannis seemed to find strength in the Red Woman's presence. In contrast, every time he was in her presence, Davos felt a bit more of him be worn away. The Riverlands will ally with House Stark and the North. The Reach has allied with House Stark and the North. Lady Olenna's granddaughter has managed to get her claws into Robb Stark, if the rumors are to be believed. The Vale has been silent. Dorne will not support my claim. The Stormlands have split between Renly and I, despite him having no claim whilst I live. The Westerlands and Crownlands appear to have gone to House Lannister, Stannis muttered, his eyes moving across the room, his voice managing to jerk Davos out of his musings. We could offer a match between one of Robb Stark's brothers and Lady Shireen to secure northern support. They are yet to declare whose claim they will support. I cannot believe they wish for the throne themselves, he said, when it became clear no one else would speak and Stannis expected a response. He did not like the idea of such a match, but he knew that, practically, it needed to be done. 3 men had declared themselves king so far and it remained to be seen who the North would support. Certainly, they would not support the Lannisters. But it was unclear whether they would support Stannis or Renly, although with Ned Stark riding at the helm of the army that was currently reportedly to be wending its way south, Davos hoped that the man would do the right thing and ally with Stannis. The North should support King Stannis because he is the rightful heir. The prince that was promised, the Red Woman murmured, raising her hand to place it gently on Stannis' elbow. It does not matter, Stannis spit out, his voice frigid. He shrugged off the Red Woman's hand and threw 2 scrolls that had been clasped in his hand onto the table. House Stark and the North have declared for another. A son of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen who has been sheltered by Ned Stark for the last 5 and 10 years. This child has the North, the Riverlands and the Reach, at least if the rumors we have received thus far are to be believed. Can they prove their claim? Cresson asked, leaning forwards and eyeing Stannis carefully. The boy says he can, Stannis replied. 2 scrolls. One where Ned Stark confirms everything that I have said about the Lannister children, that they are bastards born of incest with no shred of Baratheon in them, and that he has declared for his nephew. And another from said nephew. He has offered to meet. He interjected, understanding what Stannis was about to say. Yes, to discuss terms. His representative and one of my own. Do you not think it possible? Cresson asked, clearly picking up on the tone of Stannis' voice. A child of Rhaegar hidden in the North. The dates would certainly align. He watched as Stannis snapped his eyes to Cresson and then seemed to exhale. It is possible. Even those who hate Ned Stark agree with one thing, that he is honorable. To have sired a bastard babe of such a similar age to his true-born son was the only stain on his honor. Yet honorable men do not lie. All men lie, my lord, Cresson replied. Men lie for many things, because they can, for pleasure, for ruin, for lust, for necessity, for love. It appears Lord Stark did it for the latter too. Regardless of why he lied. He lied. As a result, I can no more trust the word of this boy than I can a Lannister. I know Lord Stark is no friend to you, Cresson counseled, his voice careful but firm, the way it always was when he was trying to talk Stannis down. But, if it is possible this is true, then it does change things. I am my brother's rightful heir. And this Jon Snow is Rhaegar's. All he need do is make a smart match and he could have 4 of the 7 kingdoms behind him. Ysilla Royce would give him some of the best Knights of the Vale, with Jon Arryn dead and Lady Lysa refusing to come down from the Eyrie. The Royces are well placed to push for action, and Yohn Royce has long been a friend to Ned Stark. I am aware, Stannis said, his voice short. Yohn Royce can call 8,000 men alone, my lord, Cresson continued, his voice challenging. If you are correct and the Reach has indeed aligned with House Stark and this Jon Snow, then even without Yohn Royce's mounted men the combined might of the Reach, the Riverlands and the North are more than enough to smash through any force that can be mustered by the other great houses combined. Having House Royce though, politically that does change things and Ned Stark is no fool, he would know this. If he means to secure this boy's claim for the throne, he would be wise to counsel him to make a match with Ysilla Royce. What have the flames shown you? Stannis asked abruptly, ripping his eyes from Cresson to stare at the Red Woman. You should not meet with this Jon Snow, she replied. You are needed here. There is a matter that will require your attention. He could not help but repress a snort, a matter that will require your attention, knowing that Stannis would fall for it. What matter? I do not know. I will consult the flames further. Do it now. The Red Woman swept from the room, head held high and back straight, without another look in their direction. But, as she passed Davos, he saw her brow was furrowed slightly. She was clearly unhappy with this turn of events. Once the door had clicked shut behind her, He turned his attention back to Stannis and Maester Cressen. He had known Cressen for many years and for nearly as many, counted the man as a friend and ally. He knew the Maester cared for Stannis, as Sir Davos did. But unlike Sir Davos, the Maester had helped raise Stannis and so was given more leeway than Sir Davos was. He just hoped that Maester Cressen would be on his side with this. Although, judging Cressen's words already, he was. He cast his eyes over the man, trying to read him. He was pleased by what he saw. Maester Cressen was worried. She was not aware of the boy's claim, Stannis said several seconds later. He ground his teeth for a moment and then took a deep swig of his water. What use is a priestess who does not know that 3 of the 7 kingdoms have allied together? He did not reply and nor did Cressen, although he saw the furrows in the Maester's forehead relax slightly. Clearly, Cressen was not unhappy by Stannis' frustration over the Red Woman. But they both knew by now it was better to let Stannis ask for their thoughts instead of trying to interject. Sir Davos, I would have your counsel on this matter. If the Reach has aligned with the North and the Riverlands, I cannot win. The Red Wine fleet is the largest in Westeros and the Mandaean fleet is not to be trifled with. The Reach armies are the most well-fed and well-resourced in the 7 kingdoms. By sheer size, their armies will outnumber mine over 10 to 1, even when the bannermen who have flocked to Renly come to my side. If I wait on Dragonstone and let the Targaryen boy beat back the armies of the Westerlands and the armies of the Crowlands, he will then take the throne and I will have to root him out. Which I cannot do with the numbers I have. If I sail for King's Landing with the army I have, I may be able to take the city, but then we will be besieged, and with the Tyrell Grains supporting this boy he could hold the siege on us until winter has been and gone, although the small folk will not let me hold it that long. They will not starve for a king. If I may, your grace, he said quietly, if the boy has offered to send a representative to meet yours in neutral lands, then we should meet him. Even if the talks are for nothing, it is an opportunity to try and learn more about the boy who claims your throne. Maester Cressen. May I speak frankly, your grace? Davos felt himself twitch slightly. At their previous meetings, Cressen had been guarded. He had said what he thought but it had been hidden behind flowery words and soft lies because of the Red Woman. You may. You cannot win this war, Cressen said, his voice calm as it always was. As you say, with the 3 kingdoms that this Jon Snow has managed to secure already, he outnumbers your troops, your ships and your supplies. He outnumbers the rest of the forces of the Seen Kingdoms. More than that, there will be houses who flock to his cause, as House Florent has to yours, whose support we would otherwise have relied on, including House Valerian, whose contribution to our fleet is nearly 1/4 of all ships. If they allied with this Targaryen child, then they will die a traitor's death. That is my point, my lord, Cressen said, his voice fraying slightly. It is not a matter of if they ally with this Jon Snow, but when. House Valerian and scores of others owe everything to House Targaryen, and many suffered under your brother's rule, rightly so given their actions in the war, but they remember. You would have me renounce my claim and support this child. I would have you be honest with yourself, Cressen replied. You have already admitted we do not have the numbers, particularly now, and we do not have the resources. Sir Davos. He froze for half a second. Now was his chance. His chance to try and talk Stannis down, because as much as he knew Stannis would make a good king, he also knew Cressen was right. Stannis would not win. He would never secure Dorne nor the Vale. Even if he managed to take King's Landing from the Lannisters, he would not be able to hold it against the combined might of the Starks, Tullys and Tyrells. You agree with Maester Cressen, Stannis said, his voice flat. I do, your grace. Why? Because you do not want this throne, he replied, frankly. Why fight for a throne you do not want and cannot win? It is mine, as Robert's heir. That is law. Asterisk. As far as the North, Riverlands and Reach are concerned, Jon Snow is Rhaegar's heir and their rightful king. Silence settled over the room. Davos exchanged a long look with Cressen but did not speak. He knew better than to do so when Stannis was thinking. Would that I had more maesters and smugglers in my service, Stannis said eventually, his voice flat and dull. More men who spoke to me of the truth of the matter and less men crawling around for scraps. My lord. Go. See what the boy has to say, you know my terms. It was a dismissal. He and Cressen left together. They walked in silence for the first few minutes, until they were far enough away from the main quarters and drawing closer to Cressen's solar. Only once one of the hideous gargoyles flanking either side of the room were in sight did Davos break the silence. What did the letter say? Cressen did not reply until the door to his solar had closed behind them and he was settled back in his armchair by the roaring fireplace. Then he sighed. To Lord Stannis Baratheon, the rightful Lord of Storm's End. Your scroll announcing the bastardry of the children Joffrey, Myrcella and Tommen has been received across Westeros. My own father has sent one similar, with one small difference, that House Stark and the North have declared for the child of Lyanna Stark and Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. For 5 and 10 years Ned Stark has kept to the vow he made to Lyanna Stark on the day she died. For 5 and 10 years he has protected me under the name he gave me, Jon Snow. You are no fool, Lord Stannis. You know that once others realize that a child of Rhaegar's lives, that they shall flock to support my claim. They will not even need proof, yet I have it, nonetheless. I do not want to fight you. I do not wish to fight more than I must. But I will retake the Iron Throne, and if I must fight every other claimant to the Iron Throne to do it, then I shall. I will send an emissary to Gulltown at the next full moon. If you wish to talk terms, then send your own. My man will find yours at the docks. King Daeron Targaryen III. King of the Andals, the Rhoynar and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm. Cressen finished speaking and sighed again. Clearly, the words were burned into his memory. He won't have liked that, Davos remarked quietly, addressing him so early in the missive as the Lord of Storm's End. Yet he is still prepared to send you to meet with this Jon Snow. What does that tell you, Davos? That Stannis does not wish for war. I never thought he did. He wishes to be king because he believes it is his duty as Robert's oldest living true-born heir, he replied. An opportunity that we can ill afford to pass up, Cressen agreed. A man who does not wish for war is a man who can be reasoned with. You wish for me to do what I can. You love him as a brother, and I as a son. I would not see him march to a war he cannot win, Cressen murmured. Our first duty to Stannis, whether he is a king or a lord, is to keep him alive. 298 AC, Olenna Tyrell. It had taken nearly 2 moons for the Lords of the Reach to gather their forces and make their way to Highgarden. Faster than she had hoped, and yet not, mayhaps, not fast enough. New rumors met her ears every day, a dragon spotted flying over the Vale, although that was surely preposterous, the Northern Lords marching, the Riverlands being sacked. And, most importantly, word had gotten out that Margaery had wed Robb Stark, which meant they had lost the element of surprise, given consensus, even amongst the servants, was that Ned Stark would not have forced a match. It did not bode well. What boded less well, was the snake currently slithering its way around the dungeons and kitchens. It might have gone undetected if it had arrived at any other time, but with their forces now mustered and over 85,000 men camped outside the walls of Highgarden, no one could sneak into the castle now. But the snake had yet to make a move, it just waited. Likely for the men to all leave so it could corner her and strike. But she was not worried. If it wanted her dead, she would be dead. So, it was here to talk. Which was, she supposed, good news. It would be much easier if he could be reasoned with, because if he could, then they might just get a bit more help in the wars to come, and she was not averse to more help given what was at stake. She had deliberately asked Sara, her principal servant, to keep the discovery to herself. And, so far, Sara had done as asked. She would need to find a way to reward the girl. Good help was so hard to come by, and she was loath to lose her to Varys or another. She sighed and scowled out her window. Garland was long gone. Hopefully, halfway to Riverrun by now, if his horse held true, and, even if he was not, he was away from Highgarden, which was good news. Willers and Margaery were still safely in the north. Loras was still lurking in Renly's bed, although reports indicated he was, at least, trying to persuade his lover to change course given the rumors of Margaery's wedding to Robb Stark. The only dark cloud was that Mace was talking to her again after several weeks of stony silence. Oh well. She couldn't have everything go her own way, she supposed. She glanced down at the scroll in her hands. Grandmother. Thank you. I am most happy. Give my love to mother and father. Margaery. Well, that was something at least. Margaery could always be relied upon to use her common sense. She is not with child, she said, turning away from the window to look at Aeleri. You are sure? She nodded. That is good news, is it not? It would be, if Margaery was not madly in love with Robb Stark, she replied as she crossed back over to her desk and then threw what remained of the Arbor Gold in her glass down her throat. It appears that even if Robb Stark should fall on the field of battle, it is not Jon Snow refusing to wed Margaery that we should worry about, but rather her refusing him. We could well end up without a child of Tyrell blood as heir to the north and without a Tyrell on the throne. You are sure? See for yourself. She thrust the letter Margaery had written at Aeleri and sat heavily down in her chair. Oh dear, Aeleri murmured a few moments later. At least she is happy. She tutted. If only Robb Stark could have gotten her with child, she would be more than happy, and our actions would not be such a risk. Aeleri did not speak for a moment, then she shifted slightly in her chair and put the scroll carefully on the table. Are you sure it was wise to inform the lords that we have allied with House Stark? Our position is quite precarious. Lord Tarly and I discussed the matter at length. He is confident that Tywin Lannister will not set his sights on us. Mace's ineptitude in the rebellion has, at least, given us the ability to pretend to be more incompetent than we otherwise are. My spies report likewise. Tywin Lannister and his forces will continue to focus on the Riverlands on the understanding that we will not meet in the northern forces before his own do. Then he will set his sights on our forces. He will likely try and secure Dorne if he can, pin us between them, so to speak. You will have to forgive me, Olenna, but that does not instill confidence. You are talking about my husband and my son. My son and my grandson, Aeleri, she replied, her voice sharp. Randyll Tarly is presuming what Tywin Lannister will do. I am not minded to work on assumptions of what Tywin Lannister will do. I will keep my silence in front of Mace and in front of his bannermen. But you are the instigator of this. You are the one who sent my children north, and you are the one who have backed us into a corner that we must fight our way out of. Are you quite finished? She said, leaning sideways slightly and opening her desk drawer. Once she had grasped the map within and turned her attention back to Aeleri, who nodded at her, she spread the map over the table and carefully straightened it out, so the edges stopped curling. Tywin Lannister must remain in the Riverlands. He cannot march south. Why? Because his son is currently still in the Vale. He does not care for Tyrion. Everyone knows this, Olenna, Aeleri said gently, as though she thought Olenna might so old that her mind was gone. I agree. He despises his son. But Tyrion is his son, Aeleri. Regardless of how he feels about the man, Tyrion is a Lannister and Tywin has no choice but to continue as he has done. Catelyn Stark did more than yank on the lion's tail when she took Tyrion Lannister. She proved that House Lannister is not as strong as they would have us believe, and she proved that the Riverlands are no friends to House Lannister. A Lannister sits on that throne and Tywin Lannister cannot afford to look weak. Joffrey did not sit on the throne when Lady Stark did what she did, Aeleri replied. Then she paused and murmured, but Cersei was queen. Quite. So, Tywin Lannister must remain in the Riverlands to show that House Lannister can still destroy their enemies. He will try to meet Robb Stark before the boy can join up with any Riverlands troops that have not yet been finished off or chased away by the Lannister forces. Then, once he has defeated Robb Stark, he will head south, for us. I see. She sighed and glanced up from where her fingers had been tracing along the line of the map. You were very young when the rebellion started, and you had 3 children to look after whilst carrying another, and you were but a babe in arms when Tywin massacred House Rayne and House Tarbeck. So, whilst you might remember what happened, but you do not remember what led to the events in question. More experience will come with time, but we are running out of it. Whilst the men are at war, I will teach you. Now, let us discuss the speech Mace will give tonight. ****. She shifted slightly and cleared her throat. On the high table next to her, Mace turned to look at her. When she nodded, he turned his attention back to the hole in front of them. She kept half an eye on him and inclined her head at Aeleri when her good daughter put a gentle hand on Mace's leg, which appeared to calm his nerves and give him strength. She watched as Mace sucked in a deep breath and then rose to his feet. It took a few moments longer than it truly should for the whole to fall silent, but once it did, all attention was on Mace. My lords. My friends. He called, his voice carrying loudly through the hall. How I wish that we were gathered under better circumstances. But, alas, war has come to Westeros. 6 and 10 years ago we marched to war for House Targaryen, and although together we won many battles together, we lost the war. And after what happened in King's Landing, the murder of Elia Martell and her children, House Targaryen was feared gone with only 2 children halfway across the world left. We had to do what was best for the Reach. We bent the knee to Robert Baratheon, and we were content to do so, knowing that it was our children that would suffer if we did not, for we had already seen what Robert Baratheon and the Lannisters would do to our women and our babes if we stood against them. But Robert Baratheon is dead, and House Baratheon is broken. My friends, you received the ravens like I did. The ravens where Stannis Baratheon and Eddard Stark have, independently, announced that they believe the children that Cersei Lannister has claimed to be the king's are not his, and I cannot claim that news would surprise any of us. Yet, even if Joffrey is the child of Robert Baratheon, if there is another alternative, I would take it. It is no secret that House Tyrell owes much to House Targaryen, and so does the Reach. House Targaryen had many flaws, but they did not kill babes in arms. And one bad apple does not mean the tree should be cut down. House Targaryen were good to us. And they are not gone. Not 2 days ago, I received a raven from the north. Eddard Stark has sheltered the child of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen for over a decade, the boy he claimed as his bastard, Jon Snow. My daughter has wed Eddard Stark's heir, Robb Stark, and has tied us to the north and to Jon Snow, the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. In time, the Reach will not only be tied by marriage to our king but by blood. And so, my lords, on the morrow we march. We march north, to the Riverlands. Together we will push House Lannister back into the Westerlands, and then, when they are beaten and Tywin Lannister is in chains for what he ordered done 5 and 10 years ago, we will march with the Riverlands, the north and our king toward King's Landing. She smiled to herself at the end of his speech, and as roars echoed around the hall. Mace had many failings, sometimes too many to count, but the one thing he could do was throw a good feast and give a good speech. Albeit aided and abetted by her. But no one need know that. On Mace's other side, Aelary cast her a quick look and a small smile. She inclined her head in response and turned her attention back to the hall. ***. She rose early the next morning, before the sun was fully up in the sky, and made her way to her solar to break her fast alone. From there, once the noise outside from the camp became so loud that it was clear the army would be leaving shortly, she made her way down to the great hall. Mace and Aelary were stood inside, alone, wrapped up in each other's embrace. She watched critically for a few moments as Mace pulled back and held Aelary at arm's length before he kissed her gently and nodded when she whispered something. Then Mace let go of his wife and turned towards her. "Mother!" he exclaimed, his eyes bright and mouth upturned. "A good feast, was it not?" "And a very good speech," she replied, crossing over to join Mace and Aelary. When Aelary smiled gently at her and Mace beamed down at her with the air of one of Willa's over-excited hounds, she continued, "I hope you will do as instructed." "I will listen to Lord Randall," Mother Mace replied dutifully. "Good. Then, because he was looking at her like a lost puppy now instead of an over-exited one, she said, raised her hand and placed it carefully on one of his puffy cheeks, "I am very proud of you." Which was, of course, not necessarily true, but it meant that Mace bounded out the room with a smile on his face and a spring in his step. She and Aelary followed at a more sedate pace. "Something is on your mind," she said after several minutes' silence had passed by and they were making their way up to the battlements to watch the army get into formation. Aelary did not reply for several moments, and instead they stood side by side watching as Mace and Randall Tarly picked their way on horseback through the moving men and towards the far head of the army. It took another half hour for the two men to reach the front, and Olenna shifted slightly as the horns blared, announcing the departure of the troops. "I just have a bad feeling. Once the Dornish know that a child of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen lives, everything will change and we are defenseless now," Aelary finally said, her voice quiet, once Mace and Randall Tarly had disappeared on the horizon. "Oh," she responded, turning away from the battlements and beginning to make her way carefully down the steps towards the courtyard. "I am quite sure that the Dornish already know." There was a muffled intake of breath, and then Aelary was hurrying down the steps after her and following her hastily across the courtyard. "How do they know?" Aleri hissed as they crossed through the outer courtyard, into the inner courtyard and began walking in the direction of the kitchens. How could you let our forces leave us defenseless? That is an interesting question, is it not? She replied as she took a sharp left and headed in the direction that the snake had last been seen in a few days prior. Once she reached the end of the corridor, she took another sharp right and then paused in the storeroom. Come on out, Prince Oberyn. My son and his army are gone, you do not need to lurk in this musty storeroom anymore. He came out of the shadows to her left, his eyes bright and his hair greasy, looking just as he had all those years ago when he had crippled her grandson, tall, slender and deadly. His hair had a touch more grey in it than it did before, and his nose was slightly longer, but otherwise he was unchanged. Next to her, Aleri took a step back. She paid her no mind. Lady Olenna, he said, his smile sharp. How long have you known I was here? A week. How long have you known that I knew you were here? A week. 298 AC, Jon Snow. He landed on a hill overlooking Gulltown in the middle of the night and thanked the old gods that the thick clouds obscured the moon. For once, luck appeared to be on his side. He slid quickly off Winter's back and walked around to push his head against hers and breathed deeply. She huffed out a breath, and smoke curled around the edges of her lips. He pulled back before it could begin to move towards his mouth, and he choked. I do not like it either, he whispered. But if we can secure one more ally, then we must try. She huffed again and darker smoke came out her mouth. You know where to go, he murmured. I will call you if I need you. She snapped slightly at him, baring her teeth in a manner that suggested she was still discontent with his plan. When he didn't flinch and instead met her gaze, she snarled and then took several steps back before launching herself into the air, heading into the mountains just behind Gulltown where she would rest and wait until she was needed. He could not keep his eyes on her for long, for she soon disappeared into the thick clouds above them. Once she was out of sight, although he could still feel her frustration rumbling through him like an itch that needed to be scratched, he turned and surveyed the hill he had landed on. He made quick work of finding a shelter against a pile of rocks that backed onto the cliff edge. Leaning up against them, he unsheathed his sword and settled down with his back to the rocks, placing his sword across his lap, and facing what he thought was the path that Winter had spotted that would lead him down to Gulltown. He stayed like that for hours, wrapped up in his thick cloak with Dark Sister on his lap. Eventually, when the sun began to appear in the sky, he rose and stretched. He made quick work of sheathing his sword and kicking dirt over the noticeable indent he had made in the soft earth. When his stomach rumbled, he tore into the dried venison he had in his cloak pocket, and once he was finished, he scouted the area properly. Lord Wyman and Lord Wendell has spoken true when they said the hills around Gulltown were naturally easily defensible. There was only one path up to the hill and the same one down. The three other ways off the hill either dropped into the sea or were sharp cliff edges with rocks at the bottom. He paused and reached out to Winter and was carefully welcomed with the distinct air of satisfaction that she had been right. He could not help but grin when he focused his thoughts on the Mandaeli men and how they had said the same thing, and she withdrew from him with a flash of annoyance. Finally, once the sun was slightly higher in the sky and he had enough light to carefully pick his way down the path, he left. He skidded a few times on little pebbles that were looser than he had expected and, at one point, hastily grabbed a sturdy tree to stop himself toppling forwards. He kept his eyes fixed almost entirely on the harbor that was coming closer as he walked. By the time the sun was fully risen in the sky, he was forcing his way between shrubs and trees and onto the docks in Gulltown. The journey had taken longer than he had anticipated, at least 2 hours, judging by the sun's position in the sky. The tide was out and so the docks were nearly deserted. Fishermen was already at sea trying to get their catch for the day, and the bigger ships that would usually dock were forced to wait for the tide to come in or to make the final few hundred meters in rowboats. He cast his eyes around the bay and smiled when he spotted the ship he knew held Sir Davos Seaworth. A spindly thing that looked like a strong gust of wind would send it smashing against the rocks. It was the only ship in the bay with no house sigil displayed. Rowing in his direction and away from the ship was a small boat containing 4 men. ****. Quite the walk, Sir Davos said, once they had crested the hill together. Aye, he replied, standing tall and watching as Sir Davos gasped slightly for air. My apologies for making you come all this way, but I wanted to be able to talk in person without anyone overhearing. We are quite safe here. I would expect nothing else from a boy who wishes to be crowned king, Sir Davos remarked, finally straightening and casting his eyes around to take in the sharp drops on three sides and the rocks Jon had slept against. You know who I am. I saw your father once, Sir Davos replied. Or should I say, I saw Ned Stark once. Either way, you look like him. You did not say anything around your men, and you gladly let me lead you away from them. I am here to negotiate and listen to your terms, the man replied. Who better to negotiate with than the man himself? Besides, I am sure you have your own defenses and would not have come alone. The men with me are good. But I would not have them killed for naught, and I am sure you do not wish me dead, for if you did then your chances at securing King Stannis as an ally will be slim. He inclined his head. Very well. Shall we begin? Sir Davos nodded. May as well. They stared at each other in silence for a few moments, then they both smiled. King Stannis is prepared to offer you the lands and keep that make up Dragonstone, Sir Davos said, after Jon gestured for him to go first. He will wed Princess Shireen to the son of a northern lord, and he will accept a representative from the north on his small council. He grimaced. Given that Westeros is well aware that Lord Stannis despises Dragonstone, and was only given it because Robert was petty and childish, that is hardly the offer he appears to think it is. Offering someone something that the offerer does not want, it is no offer at all, he replied. A northern consort for Lady Shireen and a representative from the north on the small council are reasonable offers. But not enough, Sir Davos remarked. Not enough. As you already suspected, he agreed. My terms are simple. Lord Stannis renounces his claim to the throne and supports mine. In return, I shall have Lady Shireen betrothed to my uncle, Prince Viserys, and their firstborn daughter shall wed my heir, once I have my own son. Lord Stannis will receive the Stormlands, as is his birthright, and Storm's End. Lady Shireen remains as his heir either until he has a son or until he dies. Any man of his choosing, who has proved himself competent, will be welcomed on my small council, and I would have Lord Stannis act as an advisor in the wars to come. He watched as Sir Davos' eyebrows rose and then his brow furrowed in thought. Why not wed Princess Shireen to you? She is Lord Stannis' heir. She belongs in Storm's End, with him, not in King's Landing. You would openly take King Stannis as an advisor. Why? Because he is one of the greatest commanders in Westeros. He is smart, respected by his men, and he is resilient. And an alliance with him, and him in my inner council, would show to the lords of Westeros that we are a partnership, not just allies through necessity. He will not accept this. He sighed and shifted slightly on his feet, eyes flicking over the horizon. Lord Stannis cannot win, Sir Davos. The words came out more factually than he had intended, and he watched as Sir Davos' eyes widened and the man froze slightly. I am not a boy playing at war, I know what I am doing, and I will win, he continued. His eyes watched as Sir Davos flinched slightly, a sure sign that the man realized Jon did, truly, believe that he would win. I have 3 of the 7 kingdoms. Margaery Tyrell has married my brother, Robb, and Lady Olenna has pledged that the Reach will support my claim. That gives me 100,000 men from the Reach, 20,000, minimum, from the Riverlands and 12,000 from the north. I have the biggest armies, the biggest navy and the grain. So, Sir Davos, let us go through the options. The first option, Lord Stannis aligns with House Lannister. Tywin Lannister's men are currently ravaging the Riverlands, destroying keeps and putting house and grain to the torch, and that is no secret. So, I must first secure the Riverlands. It does not matter how, only that I need to get to Riverrun. Whilst I am marching south and scooping up the Riverlands forces into the Northern Army, the Reach forces are marching north. Lord Stannis will not be able to muster his men to help the Lannister troops in time, if he so wishes, and even if he did, it would be for naught. The Lannister forces would end up either pinned between the Reach and my forces or pushed back into the Westerlands. If Lord Stannis managed to muster his forces in time, he would be smart to keep them near King's Landing because there are not enough troops there to protect the city with all the Lannister forces in the Riverlands. So, we agree that the Lannisters would need to retreat whilst Lord Stannis secures King's Landing. I am no man of war, but that sounds right given the numbers. He smiled. Given the numbers. They will retreat. Then I am faced with what to do now. Do I march into the Westerlands or do I go to King's Landing? If I go to the Westerlands, Lord Stannis could secure his position around King's Landing. Fine. I sweep up the Westerlands and then move down the Gold Road back to King's Landing. Or I take King's Landing and then move on the Westerlands. Either way I win. If King Stannis has done this and aligned with the Lannisters, then he would secure King's Landing. A siege would be long, regardless of when it began and how strong the army outside the gates was. He held out for almost a year in Storm's End. He agreed. With military men. Not with 500,000 small folk. Small folk do not react the same way as troops do. As a man from Flea Bottom, you know this. As soon as they began to starve, they would riot, and Lord Stannis would lose control of the city. And that is assuming Lord Stannis is able to take charge. Let us be honest, he will not be in charge. Joffrey will be. Sir Davos did not speak for a few moments. Then, eventually, he inclined his head. Very well. The second option, he began. If Lord Stannis does not align with House Lannister, is that he still loses. If he successfully takes King's Landing, he will face a siege from my forces once I have finished in the Westerlands and the Riverlands. If he does not, and he waits until I have secured King's Landing and tries to take it, he will still have to fight the combined might of 3 of the 7 kingdoms, and that does not consider the houses that will come to my side when they realize who I am and that my claim is true. You cannot know that, Sir Davos said. None of this proves you will win. But I do, he murmured. I do know that, Sir Davos. King Stannis would say that a battle, or war, is not won until it is won. It is already won. If I did not have the reach, it would be different. But I do. I have their men, their grains and their ships. I have nearly 150,000 men willing to fight for me. My armies dwarf even the combined might of the Westerlands, Crownland and Stormlands. I have the strongest navy in Westeros, and I have the main food supplies. And he paused, and his eyes moved over to the horizon where he could feel Winter's presence and see the outline of her body appearing below the clouds and coming closer as the seconds passed. I have her. In front of him, Sir Davos spun, hands flying to his sheath. Jon walked forward a few paces until he was level with the man and watched him closely. He-Man's brows were furrowed and his eyes squinting at Winter, but his hand had dropped from the sheath. He glanced away from Sir Davos to look at Winter, who was moving faster than he had yet seen her before. Within minutes she was easily discernible as a dragon, not the large bird that Sir Davos had clearly thought she was. She won't harm you, he said quietly, just as Sir Davos made to take a step back. I give you my word. Sir Davos glanced at him, then nodded and planted his feet back on the ground. Together they watched as Winter propelled herself forwards meters at a time, drawing closer and closer to where they stood. Then, once she was flying over the docks and heading straight to them, she loosed a roar. Next to him, Sir Davos flinched but did not back away. In the docks and harbour below them and the town that sprawled around it, screams suddenly started as the small folk realized that something was wrong. Dogs began barking and howling, and on the other side of the docks in the tall and spindly trees, hundreds of birds took flight, cawing in terror as they fled their nests. He smiled, despite himself, as Winter dropped suddenly, her tail skimming over the bay and then rose again. Within seconds she was slowing down and opening her wings at the right angle to land. She landed heavily in front of him with a crack like a giant stone breaking against a cliff. Next to him, Sir Davos sucked in a breath. He did not look at the man but instead tried to see Winter through Sir Davos' eyes. Her mouth was barred in a snarl with her lips pulled back over her teeth that were now the size of daggers, and just as sharp. Her white eyes, or at least the muscles and scales around them, were tense as though in anger. Smoke curled out of her mouth and past her. Her wings were now, at least, 100 foot. As I said, Sir Davos, he said, striding away from the man and running his hand down Winter's snout. I have her. He did not glance back at the man, knowing that Winter was watching him closely, and instead continued, I have her. She is my proof. She is large enough to ride and has been for a while. Her flames last longer and burn hotter with each day that passes. She will be unstoppable on the field of battle. So, even without my armies or my navy or my grain, I have an advantage over Lord Stannis. With her I am going to win. We are going to win. He paused and then turned to look at Sir Davos, who was staring at him, mouth open and eyes wide. He smiled gently at him, I would have Lord Stannis besides me when that happens. That he has inspired such loyalty in you that you stand here, staring at my dragon and not fleeing, it is commendable. Lord Stannis is the sort of man I would have by my side. Fighting with me. Helping me lead the troops. Rhaenys Targaryen was downed by scorpions by the Dornish, Sir Davos whispered several minutes later, his voice cracking. Your dragon is not invincible. Behind him, Winter let out another roar and another round of screams from the docks below met their ears. I know, he replied. Without even looking at Winter, he raised his hand, pressed it back against her snout. But we will take no risks. As I said, I have the largest armies, the largest navy and the grain. This war is won already, Sir Davos. It is just a matter of time. I came myself so you could see who I am. So, you understood how much I do not wish to fight Lord Stannis, not because I am scared that I will lose, or because I am a coward, but because I will win, and Lord Stannis will lose. And there is only one punishment that the lords of Westeros will accept for those who fought against me, against us, when I take my throne, and we both know what it is. A king must rule both with an iron fist, bringing justice and staying honorable, but also with compassion. I am offering Lord Stannis my compassion first. Offer Lord Stannis my terms. Below them, in the harbour, he could hear men readying themselves with weapons and calling that they should approach the hilltop where they had seen Winter land. Lord Renly. What will you do with him if you mean to give King Stannis Storm's End? He is Lord Stannis' brother, he replied. It will be for Stannis to decide what happens to his brother, particularly given Renly has not only tried to claim the throne ahead of Stannis but also took his seat. Very well. How do I get word to you with his grace's response? He turned away from Sir Davos and carefully climbed up Winter's leg until he was able to settle on her back. She tensed underneath him, ready to take flight. Send a raven to Riverrun and tell him to land at Maidenpool and secure the town. It will be the first place the troops in King's Landing look to raid. A final thing, if you would. He raised an eyebrow but nodded. Princess Shireen, will she be spared if you take the throne? I am not Tywin Lannister, Sir Davos. I do not slaughter children. She will be spared and retain her father's titles, regardless of what Lord Stannis decides, you have my word. Interlude, 298 AC, Aemon Targaryen. Did you never wish for children yourself, uncle? Jon asked, breaking the long but comfortable silence that had settled over them. He turned away from the fireplace and looked over at Jon, who was settled on the chair by his desk and staring at Aemon with his brow furrowed. It was dark in the room, the sun had set hours before and, if he was not wrong, it would soon be rising again. Jon was due to leave at sunrise, to head south and to war. In truth, Aemon knew should have sent the boy to sleep long before, for he knew Jon needed it, but he was selfish. Even sitting in silence with his nephew made him content. And so few things these days made him happy. Why do you ask? Despite the only light in the room coming from the embers of the fire he had set hours before, he could see Jon flush clearly. I just wondered. He shifted slightly and leaned more heavily against his pillows. I was very young when I took my vows as a maester, not yet a man. I was too young to know what I was giving up. And after? When you were old enough to know what you were giving up? It was too late. I had made my vows. Both as a maester and as a man of the Night's Watch, he replied. He watched as Jon frowned to himself and glanced at his lap. But yes, I have sometimes wished that I had not taken the path I had. That I had a child to call my own. I saw the joy that being a father brought to my brother, Ek, and to my father, although I am sure my father would deny it. I have longed for that myself. He paused and then sighed. Yet, if I had changed my path, we may have never met, and although I do not have a child of my own, I have you and your uncle Benjen. I cannot say I would change that. I care both for you and Benjen. I would do all that I was in my, admittedly limited, power to protect you. I will always support you both. It might not be the same love a parent has for their child, but it is something and I would not change it. Uncle Benjen cares for you too, Jon replied instantly. His voice was sharp, as though he felt Aemon doubted his words. He does not admit it. Father always said that Stark men are not good at discussing their feelings, but I know that Uncle Benjen cares for you. And he trusts you. I have seen how he looks to you for guidance, how he always ensures you have the bigger bowl of stew when we eat together, and how he fusses you. Even though he is not here, I know he will be thinking of us both. You have been watching us, he acknowledged. May I ask why? When John did not speak and instead flushed more deeply and looked away, he sighed. I see. Would it reassure you to hear that I do not regret my choices and I am content, more than content, with the life I have led? I believe your uncle feels the same. You can be assured that neither of us are sad, or alone in my case. John flushed a deeper red and shrank back slightly at his words. I will not wither away and fade without you being here, John, he said gently, leaning forwards. I will endure. I will keep going. And I will do so with pride, knowing that House Targaryen has a second chance that will not be squandered. You have given me purpose these last moons, but I am not without support and friends here. I did not mean to cause offense. You did not, he replied. I will miss you when you are gone, John. But I will not be alone. My life is filled with regrets, but staying here is no longer one of them. Do not stay here because you worry for me. I may be old and fail, but I am not yet marching towards my death. Do not talk like that about your death. Why not? I am going to die, John. I have already lived longer than every other man I have ever met. I have lived nearly twice as long as most of them. I am 100 name days. Within a few moons I will be 101 name days. I do not want you to talk about it. I do not want you to die, John said, his voice barely carrying in the quiet of the room. I do not want to leave here and never see you again. Oh John, he breathed, leaning fully up now and propping himself upright against his pillows. All men must die. It is the one certainty in life, that, one day, we will die. Do not fear my death. I do not fear it. I have lived to see almost everyone I have ever loved, die. I have stood on the sidelines as better men, braver men and smarter men than me died before their time. I have watched 7 kings sit on the Iron Throne, 6 of whom were family. I have lived through summers and winters both. I have gone beyond the wall. I have met with wildlings and former slaves. I have climbed both the high tower and the wall. I have seen Essos and Westeros, Dawn and the North. I have accomplished more in my life than many families accomplish in a generation. I am, in my many ways, on borrowed time, I fear. I still have my mind and my wits at twice the age many lose their own. I still have my sight. I still have my health. I am still capable of leaving my bed and walking across the castle unaided. I am still capable of treating the sick and of tending my own fire. But all men must die, nephew. I have time enough, but one day I will die. Do not stay here because you fear my death and wish to stay out of some sense of obligation or love. There is much you must accomplish now, and I will be there to hear of it all, I promise. When he finished speaking, he leaned forward and held out his hand for his nephew to grasp. You cannot promise that, John whispered angrily, tears falling down his face. But he took Aemon's offered hand, nonetheless. Yes, I can, he replied, squeezing John's hand as tightly between his own as he could. I will even go one better than the promise I just made. I will not die before I see you sit on the throne of our ancestors, and I know you are safe. You promise? I promise. Chapter 21, Misjudged. Chapter text. Summary, Olenna and Oberyn negotiate. Daenerys and Viserys hear news of Westeros. Stannis changes his fate. Jon reunites with the Northern Army. In our interlude, we learn why Aemon changed his view of Tyrion Lannister. Notes: I tried to get Harrenhal into this chapter, and I know I promised in the comments on the last chapter it would be included, but I just had so much other stuff to fit in, so, Harrenhal next. 298 AC, Olenna Tyrell. Is your granddaughter happy in the match she had found with Robb Stark? Oberyn Martell leaned back on his chair until the front 2 legs were suspended off the ground. Then, he took a leisurely sip of his Arbor Gold and inspected her over the top of it, a small smirk on his face. Listening in on other people's conversations is incredibly rude. But I am not sure why I would expect better from you, she replied tersely. Then she snorted. She is very happy. You must be furious. That she is happy. That she wed the future Warden of the North. It is not the match you had in mind, I think. It is not, she acknowledged. But she is wed to the brother of the king, and she is happy. You still plan to get Tyrell blood on that throne then? It would be a tragedy if Robb Stark fell on the field of battle, would it not? It would, she snapped, her voice sharp. On the other side of her desk, Oberyn Martell slammed the chair back into the ground with his mouth making a little O expression as though he was genuinely surprised by her reply. Did you know before they wed? I did. The Lannisters would give whoever told them that fact anything they desired, he remarked, his voice silky. We both know you have no intention of telling the Lannisters anything. A small smile flickered over his lips, and he inclined his head. That is true. You have a proposition for me, she said eventually when he did not speak. What makes you so sure? Because the only reason you would have lurked in our cellars like some sort of common criminal is because you know I will say yes but my son would not. You would have overruled your son. I would, she agreed. So, you did not wish him here when you made the offer. He inclined his head again. We know of Jon Snow, of course. Of course. Varys told me. That made her eyebrows raise, despite her desire to maintain a blank facade. When? I was in King's Landing. To find out why Ned Stark fled, I presume. Yes, apparently, he considers the murder of unborn babes to be distasteful. He did fall out with Robert Baratheon over the murder of your niece and nephew. I am not sure why you seem surprised he would still consider the murder of children to be repugnant. Oberyn Martell did not reply for a moment. Then he leaned forward and put his glass carefully on the desk. Ned Stark saved his nephew, and now that nephew claims the Iron Throne that should have been my nephew's. Varys told you because he wished you to support Jon Snow's claim, she inferred. Will you? Yet to be determined. What are your terms? I did not think Jon Snow had yet named a hand. He has not. But as you noted, my granddaughter is married to his brother. My son's forces will make up the bulk of his army and my son's navy will blockade King's Landing. We control the grain supplies. I am sure you will agree that Jon Snow will owe House Tyrell much by the time this war is done. He shifted on his seat and stared at her. She stared back. I cannot say what Dorne will want in exchange for our support, Prince Oberyn said eventually, his voice soft and careful. But I can say what I want. The Mountain. And Amory Lorque. Both are reported to be in the Riverlands. You are well informed. My son and my second grandson have ridden to war. My first grandson and my granddaughter are in the north and entangled so deeply with House Stark that should this coup fail, we will all lose our heads. My youngest grandson, well, she replied. House Tyrell needs to be informed. I want them both. Then have them, she muttered, growing tired of the back and forth. Muster your brother's armies, march north and demand your right to take their heads yourself. It would take moons for my brother to muster his forces, Prince Oberyn replied. If at all. If you wished to ride north with my son's armies you would have announced your presence before now. I would. We are at war, Prince Oberyn. I do not have time for your tricks or games. Speak clearly or leave. You sent your second grandson to Riverrun. Why? He asked, his voice more curious than it had been for the entire conversation. At her blank look he added, the servants' talk. It is where Ned and Robb Stark will go. I do not think you sent your grandson riding off to Riverrun, whilst the Riverlands burns, because you want him to see his good brother. It is something your son would do. But not you. She took a careful sip of her wine to buy herself a few moments. There is a delicate question which I wished to be asked to Ned Stark in person, she said eventually, doing her best to keep her voice level. Only a fool trusts a raven in a time of war. Will you tell me what that question is? No. Why not? Because it neither concerns you or I, and until Ned Stark has told me how he wishes to proceed, I will speak of it to no one. It must be quite delicate. It is, she replied, her voice tart. I grow weary of this conversation, so let us get to the point. In the time it would take your brother to muster the Dornish banners and march north, the war will likely be as good as over. At least the bit you care about. The Northern Army marches south and the Reach Army marches north. They will meet the Lannister sooner rather than later. I agree. I was not looking for your agreement, she remarked. Across the table, Prince Oberyn glowered at her, his lips twisting and eyes flinty. Nevertheless, I am glad we are in agreement, it will make this easier. You want to be the one who kills the Mountain and Lork yourself. I have already said. She nodded at the confirmation. Ned Stark is no fool, not the brightest mind in Westeros, that is for certain, but he is no fool. If you ride into the Northern Army, because even you are not arrogant enough to believe your presence in the Reach Army would be welcomed by my son, then Ned Stark will do all he can to send you away or keep you from his nephew. In truth, I do not know Jon Snow enough to know what he will do. But I would place good money on it not being the reception you long for. It is a conundrum, Prince Oberyn replied. Not really, she remarked blithely, leaning forwards and pouring another slosh of Arbor Gold into her wine glass and taking a small sip. The best way to prove that you and Dorne mean no harm to Jon Snow is through marriage. Which you already knew and is why you waited for my son to be gone before you approached me. He smiled sharply at her and raised his glass. Does your brother approve? I will write to him once our negotiations are completed. Any match made between the Reach and House Martell will require House Martell to support Jon Snow as the rightful king. I will not send a grandchild of mine to Dorne. I expected no less. You will send Quentyn to Highgarden. He will be our guest until this war is done, and after, he shall wed my granddaughter the Lady Desmara Redwine. We will find them a keep and they will remain here. There was a brief pause whilst the man in front of her considered his words. Eventually he nodded sharply. In exchange, you will write to your brother and request that Quentyn comes by ship to Old Town. From there he will travel to Highgarden. Once he has arrived and his guards have left. Oh come now, surely you did not expect me to agree that he could maintain guards with him whilst we are at war. Doran will not approve. If you want your chance to kill the Mountain and Amory Lork, then you will persuade him, she replied, placing heavy emphasis on the words. As I was saying, once he has arrived and his guards have left, I will write to Riverrun to confirm that our agreement has been completed. In the meantime, once you have written to your brother, you will write to Riverrun with a letter from me confirming that your support is true, and House Tyrell await a hostage to your behavior, and once that hostage has been received, that you can be trusted. That is all. Yes. That does not seem like much of a demand. Quentyn is not Doran's heir. Arianne is. I am aware, she replied. But I will not send a grandchild of mine to Dorne. Prince Oberyn was silent for so long that she thought he had fallen asleep. His eyes had dropped to the floor, and he seemed to be considering what to say next. Eventually, once she had finished the wine in her glass and was halfway through her third glass of the morning, he raised his eyes to look at her. I am truly sorry for what happened to Willers. She felt the breath leave her lungs even as she flinched at his words. It does not change what happened. You crippled him. It was not by design. But it happened nonetheless. When do you need me to leave? Write to your brother today, you can use one of our ravens. Then I suggest you leave in the morn. Very well, he replied, rising to his feet. He paused and considered her for a moment. My daughter Sarilla, she is in Old Town. That is of no consequence to me. If you do not object, I will ask that she joins her cousin when he arrives in Old Town and accompanies him here. If war is brewing, I would prefer she be in Highgarden than in Old Town. Your pretty words hide your true intentions, she murmured, leaning back in her chair. You are offering me a second hostage to your actions. Sarilla is well known to be the least aggressive of your children. He inclined his head but did not speak. She will be welcome here, of course, she heard herself say. I shall write to Lord Lytton and inform him of our decision. She paused and then sighed. And I shall ask him to ensure that she is given access to the Citadel Library as necessary until your nephew arrives and they make their way to Highgarden. A woman she may be, but there is no harm in allowing her to bring some of her texts with her. When he raised an eyebrow, she sighed more loudly. There is only one reason a girl spends time in Old Town, and it is not for the seafood. A small smile flickered over his face. Very well. I shall speak to your maester. He turned and crossed the room. She watched him go, unable to squash the feeling that she needed to say more. Eventually, she decided on what to say. My grandson still considers you a dear friend, Prince Oberyn, she said, her voice soft but carrying in the silence of the room. When he paused with his door on the handle, she hid a smile, there has been enough war in Westeros for both our lifetimes, and if your brother does agree this match, we will be bound by blood soon enough. I hope you recognize the chance I am giving you. He turned to look at her, his eyes softer than they had been when he had first entered her room. I do. And so will my brother. 298 AC, Daenerys Targaryen. Pentos was just how she remembered it, impressive but with a seedy underbelly. She watched as it came into view in the distance and sighed quietly to herself. On the hills, the manses stood tall and nearly glowing in the early morning light, yet she knew that underneath them in the streets and alleys, poverty reigned. I am sorry that we had to come back here, Viserys murmured next to her, his voice heavy and sad. She glanced at him. He was stood tall next to her with his eyes fixed on the port city. Nothing in his posture gave away any unhappiness, but it was plain from looking at how tightly his hands clung to the rails and how tense his shoulders were that he was not happy. You need to forgive yourself, she said quietly, conscious of the few Dothraki on the ship watching as Pentos appeared on the horizon and her servants nearby as well as Ser Jorah and Oren. I spoke truly when I said I wished for you to stand with me when we return home, and you cannot do that if you continue to dwell on the past. What I did, he whispered, his voice cracking. She watched as his hands tightened around the rails even further. Was awful, she replied. And I shall never forget it. He turned to glance at her. Sometimes, he began, then he stopped and turned away again. Sometimes you wish it had worked and you think you would do it again if you thought it would work, she finished. When he turned back to stare at her, eyes wide in horror and mouth parted, she reached over to put a gentle hand on his arm. I know. I cannot say that I understand, or that I can accept it, because I can't, but I meant what I said, Viserys. You are my brother. I will not turn my back on you unless I have no choice. Dany. No, brother. You saved my life. You. I hate you for what you did to me. But you are my brother and, when it came to it, you saved my life when you could have let me die, when it was obvious that Drogo was going to die, and you would never get your army. You made your choice that day, as I have made mine. He did not reply. Princess Oren said, breaking through the silence that had settled between her and Viserys. The small island there, that is where you should send the dragons. She glanced in the direction that Oren had gestured and then turned to look at him fully. You are sure? He nodded. No one lives on them, the sailors assure me. She glanced back at the sailors of their ship who, as always, were doing their best to avoid her gaze. Very well. She called for her children to fly down and watched as Balerion snapped at Arion's tail, nearly grabbing it with his teeth. Both she and Viserys took a hasty step back as the three dragons landed on the railings of the ship and snapped at each other as they vied for attention. Jaerion let out a roar that was a far cry from the little kitten noise he had once made. Instead, the noise sent a shiver down her spine as he moved along the railing to try and see her son, who was cradled against Doria's chest. Khaleesi? Doria asked, her voice soft and gentle as always. When Daenerys nodded, understanding the unasked question, Doria made her way forwards until she was stood between Daenerys and Viserys, close enough that Jaerion could extend his neck and rub his head against Rhaego. I envy him, Viserys said, his eyes fixed on her son. To grow up with a dragon as the Targaryens of old did, it is a gift. She smiled at her brother and reached out to rub her hand along Jaerion's snout as he turned to her for affection next. And yet Jaerion will wait longer than his brothers to take his rider. There was a brief pause as Jaerion pulled away from Daenerys and fixed Viserys with a look. Then, for the first time, one of her dragons that was not Aerion shoved his head against Viserys and let her brother run one, trembling, hand down his neck. She smiled at the sight and then turned away slightly to give her brother privacy when she realized there were tears starting to bloom in his eyes. Her eyes met Doria's and they exchanged a small smile. You do not mind holding him? She asked. No, Khaleesi. It is an honor, the girl replied. Rakero, Ago, Jago and I will keep him safe. Thank you, my friend, she murmured. I do not have good memories of this place, and though I wish my son close, it is better that we are separate until we are truly safe. We shall keep him safe, Doria replied, his voice firm. Behind her, Jago nodded his head in agreement and his hand moved to his arrow. She nodded and turned to glance at Viserys, who was murmuring something to Aerion, who had replaced his brother and had pushed his head against Viserys' chest and was crooning deeply. "Shall we send them away, brother?" He twitched slightly, still unused to her attempts to include him in her decisions, and then nodded. He pulled away from Aerion, and then together they gave the dragons the orders of where to go to wait for them. Jaerion took off first, his cream wings pushing him up and away from their ship, and towards the small island they had pointed to, quickly. He did not wait for his brothers to catch up as he flew off. Aerion followed him soon after with a sharp roar that made Doriae jump. Only Balerion remained behind. She sighed. "Jaqargan, Balerion." He cocked his head slightly, like a hound would do, and stared at her. "Jaqargan, Balerion," she said again, her voice sharper. He shuffled slightly on the railing but did move. Sighing again, they reached out to touch him, but he jumped to the side and snapped at her. "Stubborn, like his mother," Viserys remarked, a soft smile on his face. She scoffed and watched as Balerion, finally, took flight. A few hours later they sailed smoothly into the deep harbor in Pentos. The docks went out for nearly a quarter-mile into the bay, but, thankfully, with the tide in as it was, they were able to weigh anchor close to the shore. She cast her eyes past the bustling docks, up the hill to the manses, including the one that had belonged to the Fat Magister, and then around the docks properly, taking in every sight and smell. "That is it," Oren whispered to her as he came to lean on the railing next to her. His hand extended and pointed towards a ship anchored just past theirs, closer to the city than she had expected, with a silver hull. It was big, easily dwarfing the other ships in the harbor. "The Pride of Driftmark," he continued. "It is very impressive," she replied politely. He laughed as though he saw right through her pleasantries and knew she had no idea whether the ship was impressive or not. "If you will forgive me, I have a matter that requires my attention. Denise will see you onto our ship. If my men have done as ordered, it will be fully provisioned and we can set sail on the morrow." She watched as he left the ship, taking Alfred, the very sour-faced man who had done nothing but complain and whine the entire time he had been in their company, with him. As though sensing her gaze on him, Oren turned and gave her a smile and then threw his arm over the other man's shoulder, tugging him against him and whispering in his ear. She watched as Alfred twitched slightly and froze but was carefully dragged along by Oren. "Shall we, princess?" Denise asked, his voice firm but polite as always. She nodded, her gaze flicking briefly to the island in the distance her dragons were on. Together they disembarked the ship. Behind them she heard Viserys escorting Doriae and talking quietly. There was a lengthy pause and then she heard the thudding of hooves that indicated the Dothraki were bringing their horses down the gangway with them. "Will there be space on your ship for the horses?" she asked, feeling foolish she had not asked before. "Yes," Princess Denise replied. "The Pride of Driftmark is a warship, we have space for nearly 10 times as many horses as your Dothraki have." She nodded. "And provisions for them? Hay or straw?" "One of the men will go and get it in the markets. Won't be hard to find." She turned to look at the man who sounded happier and brighter than he had in moons. "You are pleased to be going home, Denise?" "Yes. I have missed my son and daughters." "I never asked about your family, my apologies," she said, a flush creeping over her face. "'Tis no bother," Princess Denise replied. "My son will have been pleased by my absence, he has been eager to prove himself to Lord Montfort for years now. With me away he will have taken on my duties as Master-at-Arms." "I did not know that was your role," she replied, feeling further embarrassed. "I have not seen you spar since we met." "I don't spar with live steel," he replied. "Learned not to the hard way," he continued, raising one hand to show the stump of 2 missing fingers. When she flinched, he grinned at her. "But there are training swords and other weapons on the ship, I shall enjoy pitting myself against your Dothraki." "You do not wish to spar against me?" Ser Jorah asked as he drew level with them. "I saw you at the tourney of Lannisport and followed you through the breach at Pike," Ser Jorah Denise replied, his voice sharp. "I have no desire to embarrass myself in front of Princess Daenerys nor Prince Viserys." "Ser Jorah is that good?" "Yes, Prince Viserys," Denise muttered. "A strong fighter on both horseback and on foot. I dare say he could pit himself against any of the Dothraki in Essos." "Surely he cannot be that good?" Viserys asked, his voice incredulous. I mean no offense, Ser Jorah, but the Dothraki are formidable. Ser Jorah finished, his voice gruff. We see Rakero barked out in broken common tongue, coming to stride next to Daenerys and gesturing behind him to Ser Jorah. Behind him, his horse Winnet. Be honor. She grimaced. Training weapons only. I don't want either of you too injured to fight because you wished to test yourselves against each other. He frowned at her but then nodded once and slowed down until the rest of the Dothraki caught up with him. It did not take them long to reach the Pride of Driftmark and, with Daenerys leading the way, they were quickly up the gangplank and onto the ship. Crew. Daenerys barked out, his voice carrying far and getting the attention of the men milling about on deck. Daenerys watched as several men cheered when they realized who had addressed them. We leave on the morrow. Go and find any men in the city and tell them that we leave on high tide in the morn. Where we going? Where's Oren? One man asked, glancing at Daenerys and Viserys curiously and then away again. Bidding farewell to our esteemed friend who helped us find Prince Viserys and Princess Daenerys. Daenerys watched as the two men exchanged a long look. The man who had spoken jerked his head in a nod and then glanced over to the far side of the ship and yelled, Robert, go to the markets and get hay for the horses. Alan, help him. Two skinny boys, barely out of childhood, who looked like they could barely lift a bale of hay between them, took off at a run down the gangplank and off towards the city. I have to ask, the man began, then he trailed off awkwardly. Does Lord Montfort know? My brother is the one who sent us to retrieve the Prince and Princess, Oren replied, appearing next to Daenerys as though summoned. He glanced at her and, realizing his unasked question, she nodded, so he continued, it appears a child of Rhaegar lived. We are to reunite Daenerys and Viserys with their nephew. It is to be war then, the man replied. Yes, Adam. It is to be war. There was an uncomfortable silence over the deck of the ship. Then, eventually, an old man who had been sat on some crates on the corner of the deck said, this is good news. Dunks. The first man, Adam, asked, his voice sounding bemused. War ain't never good. The old man grinned, exposing yellowing teeth. Then he rose from his crate and hobbled over to join the group. Behind her, Daenerys was dimly aware of Ser Jorah twitching slightly. The old man, Dunks, stopped about a foot away from her and Viserys and gave them considering expressions. You do not know, he said at last. The rumors have not yet reached your ears. What rumors? Dragons, another man said, his voice low and awed. Rumors that dragons have returned. Daenerys and Viserys exchanged a brief look. A dragon? Viserys asked, his voice bordering between skepticism and amusement. A dragon, the man replied, his voice level. Traders from Gulltown claim that it came from the east, a fearsome thing with teeth like daggers. It swept over the ships anchored in the bay and the town and landed in the hills in the north of the town. It left but minutes later, heading towards the Eyrie. How big did they say it was? She asked, cutting across her brother as he made to open his mouth. A believer are you, princess? She avoided casting her eyes back to the ship they had just disembarked and instead said, why wouldn't I be? Dragons existed once before. What is to say they do not live again? Quite so, Dunks replied, leaning heavily to one side and then grasping one of the railings to stay standing. How big was it? The man who had told them of the dragon fixed her with a piercing look and said, his voice low and urgent, big enough to be ridden. The sailors swear blind that a man rode on the back of the beast when it left Gulltown. Where did it go? West. Not north? She asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Why the fuck would it go north? Nothing there but snow, shit and miserable northerners. Dunks barked out a laugh. Who cares where it's gone? The point is that it was in the Vale. Between rumors of the boy king being a bastard born of incest between his mother and the Kingslayer, the pillaging of the Riverlands, and the Northern Army marching south, war is coming. War is coming to Westeros. House Targaryen is going home to join their kin and his dragon. Pardon? Viserys said, his voice carrying on the silent deck. You really haven't heard? Dunks asked, his voice going from amused to slightly horrified. Of course, we fucking haven't, Daenerys barked. Been at sea for a moon and before that with the Dothraki. Robert Baratheon is dead. Catelyn Stark took Tyrion Lannister hostage, at least according to the rumors, and Tywin Lannister has set the Riverlands ablaze in response. The Northern Army marches south whilst Stannis and Renly Baratheon mean to press their separate claims. We've been sat here for nearly 3 weeks wondering what the fuck we do. Montford sent word that he needs the Pride back. Scrambling to not throw up, knowing that war had already come, and they were not ready, she gave the man a small tight smile and turned away from him, towards Oren, who was looking at her in mild confusion, and Viserys, who gave her a tight nod. Oren, the ship leaves today. 299 AC, Davos Seaworth. Were it any other man, Sir Davos Stannis murmured. Were it any other man I would call them a liar and they would suffer the appropriate punishment for lying to their king. Your Grace? He asked, feeling confusion tinging the edge of his words. As he turned to look at Stannis, his eyes flicked past Cresson, who was staring at him in slightly horror, and the Red Woman, whose mouth was set in a firm line. I sent you, Sir Davos, because I trust what you say. There is no other man in my service I trust more, Stannis continued, his voice flat. How big was it? Big, he replied. Cresson's lips twitched in slight amusement, and it was that which made him continue, wingspan at least 100 feet. He paused and, realizing that the wingspan did not really tell Stannis what he needed to know, he said more strongly, big enough that it could carry a man nearly full-grown with ease. It crossed the distance between the sea on the horizon and us on the hill in a few minutes. Stannis cast him an appraising look. And the boy? More Ned Stark's son than Rhaegar's, I would say, he replied carefully. They had been over this already. Many times, in fact, since he had returned to Dragonstone. He had yet to meet Marya or his sons or have a bath. He stunk of sweat and salt, and he knew that he looked twice as bad. He had not slept since Jon Snow had departed on the back of his dragon and, in truth, he did not think he would sleep until Stannis decided what he would do. So far, they had only gotten as far as confirmation that Jon Snow did, indeed, have proof he was a Targaryen, in the form of a dragon, and the support of the Reach. Dragons can be killed, of course, Stannis said eventually, his voice flat again. I said much the same thing, Your Grace. Stannis barked out a harsh laugh. And yet here you stand. Perhaps the boy is more Ned Stark than Rhaegar, as you say. What was his response? I know, he replied, quoting what Jon Snow had said back to him. He is either arrogant, or foolish then. I do not think so, he replied cautiously. When Stannis' eyes flashed away from the table and to him, he pressed on, he said he would take no risks. And why should he? He has the largest armies and the largest navy. Which begs the question why he wants me to support his claim, to be his ally, if he is so sure he will win. I do not think it is to do with you, he mused, speaking before he realized he had spoken. He froze then, when Stannis raised an eyebrow, pressed on, I think he wants this war to be as bloodless as possible. He did not strike me as the sort to enjoy the pain or suffering of others. Ned Stark's son, Stannis muttered, making the statement sound like an insult more than a compliment. What of Lady Shireen? Cresson asked once a heavy silence had settled over the table. Surely you discussed that, Sir Davos. To be spared, he replied, his eyes fixed on Stannis. Regardless of any choice that his grace makes, Lady Shireen will be spared and retain her father's titles. As he had spoken, Stannis had jerked his head slightly to stare at the table and then frozen. The man's shoulders tightened, and Davos could hear his teeth grinding together. He hid a sigh because, for all Stannis tried to hide it, he did love his daughter. He did not always show it, and he certainly did not always act like he did, but there was love there. He had wondered, once, whether Stannis was ashamed of his daughter, for he never seemed to speak to Shireen nor to spend time with her. Then, he had realized that Stannis was far from ashamed of his daughter, he feared for her, and he was unable to show his emotions properly. Sir Davos, Cresson said, his voice coaxing, clearly having picked up on Stannis' frustration and tension. Did Jon Snow say anything else? He paused for half a second, wondering whether he should make the full offer to Stannis, knowing already that the man would say no to the offer to match Viserys to Shireen, and then spoke, yes. He offered any man of his grace's choosing a place on his small council, and he requested that his grace advise him in the wars to come. He then offered Storm's End and a match between his uncle, Prince Viserys Targaryen, and Princess Shireen. He did not offer a match between my daughter and himself. I asked that same question, Your Grace. He said that as your heir, Lady Shireen belonged in Storm's End with you, not in King's Landing. I assume that would mean that should I accept his offer of a match between my daughter and his uncle that Shireen would keep the Baratheon name. I did not ask, Your Grace. Although it does not matter, Stannis continued, as though Davos had not spoken. I would not wed my daughter to the son of the Mad King nor to a boy I have not met. Stannis paused and Davos watched as he turned his attention to the Red Woman who had been quiet since Davos had entered the room. You did not see a dragon in the flames. First you did not know that a son of Rhaegar lived, then you did not know that it was likely 3 of the 7 kingdoms had allied, and your latest error is that you did not know that dragons were back. You said I was needed here, that a matter required my attention, and yet nothing of consequence transpired. The Red Woman did not speak. Her eyes were fixed on the flames in the torch brackets in the corner of the room, and she appeared, for all the world, like she was not aware that she had been spoken to. I came here, following the visions my God gave me, in search of the prince that was promised. I thought that Dragonstone was where the prince would be born, she said suddenly. When I gaze into the flames, I must interpret the visions I am given. And you interpreted wrong. You do not need to be king to be the prince who is promised. You have been pushing me to be king, telling me that it is my right, and now you say I should not. She did not reply. You cannot even admit when you made a mistake, Stannis snapped, his voice louder than Davos had heard in years. Your mistake, your push for me to be king, could have doomed us all. If I had ignored your advice that I was needed on Dragonstone, I could have met with Jon Snow already and taken his measure myself. Your Grace, the Red Woman began, her voice soft and melodic as always. No, Stannis said, cutting the Red Woman off before she could begin. I brought you into my confidence because my wife spoke highly of you. I can see now that she was misled in her beliefs, as are you. Your presence on my council is no longer required. I shall not banish you from Dragonstone, for I would not wish to hurt my wife so, but I do not wish for your presence around this table. In the silence that followed the end of Stannis' words, and the Red Woman fleeing the room, Davos exchanged a long look with Cresson, who tilted his head slightly. He felt himself freeze and he averted his eyes. Cresson had a hand in this, of that Davos was certain. Something had happened whilst he was gone. Might I speak, Your Grace? Cresson said, leaning forwards carefully in his seat to fix Stannis with a cautious look. When Stannis nodded, Davos watched as Cresson took a deep breath and then said, This Jon Snow has proof of his claim and the support of the Riverlands and the Reach, so this war is won. He is correct, in that regard. As we said last time we spoke, there will be lords and ladies in Westeros who both we and the Lannisters would have relied on to support our respective armies, who will join Jon Snow's cause. House Valerian, Stannis muttered, his voice dark. And House Celtigar, I think. Likely others, Cresson agreed. If he is lucky, Jon Snow may well secure Dorne as well. Their lust for vengeance may well outweigh their anger that a child of Lyanna lived whilst Rhaenys and Aegon did not. Your advice? Stannis bit out, grinding his teeth. You have advice. I would hear that, not well-trodden arguments. Feast your lords tonight, they are all gathered and waiting for orders. Tell them that you have allied with Jon Snow, and then take your troops to Maidenpool and do as Jon Snow bids. Do not fight and lose your head in a war you cannot win for a throne you do not wish to sit on, Cresson said. Then he sighed and leaned forward, wincing painfully when he clearly jostled his bad hip, and continued, I do not recommend you take the offer that Jon Snow has given you with regards to Shireen. He has offered you Storm's End, which in truth is no offer, since Storm's End should always have been yours. If I might be so bold, do as Jon Snow bids, and then, when you meet in person, negotiate a new agreement. What would you suggest? That the firstborn daughter of Shireen is betrothed to his firstborn son, and if that cannot be done, then a match is made with House Stark. Eventually, House Baratheon will reunite with House Targaryen. Shireen was to be queen when I was dead, Stannis said, his voice flat. She has never wished to be queen, Cresson replied. She does what you ask to make you proud. Stannis flinched, then inclined his head. She knows her duty. It appears you know my daughter better than I do. You see her through a father's eyes, and a father's eyes are soft and look for likeness in their children. They do not look for disagreement and often overlook parts of their children that they do not wish to see. It does not mean that a child is any loved less, but sometimes others can give a better perspective. Silence echoed around the chamber after Cressen's words. Davos half expected Stannis to turn them out of the room as he had with the Red Woman, but instead the man turned away from them and crossed away from the painted table and gazed out at the sea beyond Dragonstone. Davos glanced at Cressen, who smiled tightly. Clearly his words had been both about Shireen and about Stannis himself. "I have taken your advice for near 20 years," Stannis said eventually, turning away from the sea to look at Cressen. "And there is good reason for that." Silence settled back over the room as Stannis stared at Cressen, who stared back. Without realizing he had done so, Davos took half a step back, as though to put distance between Stannis and the silent conversation he was having with Cressen. "Only boys of summer long for war. Only fools fight a war they cannot win. I am neither, and, it appears, neither is Jon Snow. It was my duty to fight for the throne, by rights and by law. Robert won the throne through conquest and through blood. If a son of Rhaegar's lives, then he can win the throne back the same way." As Davos watched, Stannis drew himself up straight and grasped his hands behind him as he gazed around the room. "Send word to my brother, Maester Cressen. Tell him that I wish to parley. That once I have his word that we will be received, that my armies shall set sail to Storm's End." "Your Grace?" Davos asked, feeling trepidation flood through him. Stannis glanced to him, ground his teeth slightly, and bit out, "Send word to Riverrun. Tell Jon Snow I go to Storm's End. If he is half as smart as you claim, Sir Davos, he will understand what it is I plan to do." "Forgive me for asking, but what is it you plan to do, Your Grace?" "My lord," Stannis said, his voice heavy, and it took Davos half a moment to realize that Stannis had corrected him, not addressed him. "Jon Snow is right. I cannot win his war. But I will not stand by and follow him blindly by mustering my forces to hold a town that is not of importance. He says he would have my advice and he would install me as his Lord Paramount of the Stormlands, then he must accept I cannot claim that until Renly has been dealt with. My brother still makes his own claim for the throne, and as foolish as he is and as little time, regard and love I hold for him, he is my brother. My responsibility and my duty to Jon Snow, as his Lord Paramount of the Stormlands and head of House Baratheon, compels me to first deal with my responsibilities. So, no, I will not hold Maidenpool for Jon Snow. I shall go south, and reason with my brother." 299 AC, Jon Snow. It took 3 weeks for him to find the Northern Army, and so, by the time he reunited with them it was nearly a moon and a half after he had left them. They were just south of the crossroads and the Trident when he spotted them in the distance, 20,000 men at least. Clearly, lords from the Riverlands had joined their forces with father as he wended his way south. He smiled at the sight. Not only had his father made good progress, but he also had more men. They were, mayhaps, a less than half a day's hard ride of Harrenhal, if he remembered his distances well, which he did. In the distance he could see Harrenhal, its towers looming nearly as high as the clouds and the stone black like the dragon bones Aemon had told him about. He sent a quick thanks to the gods that the weather was poor, rain steadily beating down, and another praying that no one but his army would see winter as she landed. He made winter circle twice, hundreds of feet above the encampment. Then he guided her down to land at the edge of the encampment and dismounted quickly, pressing his head against her neck and breathing in her scent. "Ipredagon. Ao Joralagan aha Kustin," he murmured quietly. He was dimly aware of Winter turning her neck around and bumping her snout against his back, and he smiled to himself. "Jakagan." He took a few steps back and watched as she launched herself into the sky in a few strong beats of her wings. Before long she was turning west, towards the Trident. Will she go far? He turned, arms already opening to embrace his brother. "No. Just to find enough food to see her through until Harrenhal is taken." Robb gripped him back and then pulled away. "Father is waiting in the command tent." "Ghost hunting?" He nodded and made to begin walking into the camp, but Robb put his arm out, stopping him. He paused and glanced at his brother. "Something is wrong. Harrenhal is more fortified than we had expected." "How many?" 5,000, is our best guess." He did not speak for a few moments and, eventually, Robb dropped his arm. "That is fine," he murmured, beginning to walk towards camp. "Any news of your mother?" Rob shook his head. No. It is foolish that I had hoped she would appear with the Knights of the Vale. No, of course not. She was in the Vale, and she knew the Riverlands were being burnt. If she was smart, she will have gone north or stayed in the Eyrie. That is what worries me. That is not all he observed. He glanced around them as they walked and inclined his head at several of the soldiers he recognized and could not help but flush when they bowed in return. He averted his eyes and fixed his gaze on the tents ahead of them. The further south we have moved and the bigger the army has grown, the more chance we have of a spy being in our midst. It would be folly to assume they were not there before we came south, he observed. But I agree. When did you arrive here? This morn, early, Rob replied. The men are well rested. No. He took a moment to consider how best to reply before deciding to be honest. We cannot wait. The troops in Harrenhal will know that the Northern Army is here. We need to move fast. I agree, Rob murmured. Father and I had set up the Northern and Riverlands lords in the command tent. We had not yet started when word reached us of winter on the horizon. You think we should attack on the morrow? You don't. He did not speak for a moment as they drew closer to the command tent that was set in the middle of the encamped army. Then he shook his head. No. Not on the morrow. ***. Lord Umber, he said, moving his hand across the map and not looking up at the giant man across the table from him. You and Lord Root will take 500 men to the west. I am not to be part of the attack. Lord Richard Root asked, his voice heavy with frustration. No. When they realize the castle is overrun, they will flee. We cannot afford for them rejoin the bulk of the Lannister forces or fortify other castles. Harroway town is but half a day's ride north of Harrenhal. You know these lands better than any other man here. Your experience and knowledge will be needed to ensure no Lannister men escape. His words had the desired effect and Lord Root flushed a deep red behind his thick brown beard and bowed deeply, nearly touching the table with his nose as he did so. If I might be so bold, Your Grace, we shall only need half that number, the man said once he had risen upright again. Only half? He asked, unable to stop the skepticism from seeping into his voice. Yes, Your Grace, Lord Root replied. The lands between here and High Heart are said to be cursed, the small folk and nobles alike avoid it, and much of the land is boggy and unfarmable. It is part of the reason Harrenhal is so defensible, for you cannot march men from the west because of the bogs, nor the south because of the lake. He nodded in recognition of the Lord's logic. So, they will flee north. Or east. East is fine, I have a plan for the east. Very well, Your Grace. What do we do with any prisoners? Gratian asked, his hand on the pommel of his sword as though he knew exactly what he wished to do. Take their weapons and their armor, he replied after a few moments. If the mountain is amongst them, kill him if you can, but take no risks. You do not wish his taken prisoner. I value your life and the lives of our men more than I wish for Gregor Clegane to fall into my hands. If you must make the choice between confronting him and letting him pass, let him pass. He is but one man, one of the Riverlands lords that John could not remember the name of. He has been at the front of the damage done to our houses. We cannot just let him flee. He is a man that tried to kill Loras Tyrell when the boy unseated him in a Moyatoni, father interjected quietly. He must die. But we should not gamble with the lives of our men to do it. He nodded to his father when their eyes met and said, My father speaks true. Gregor Clegane is a monster. But he is strong and capable. I have no doubt of the crimes he has committed, including those against my own family, but our numbers as they stand are too small to risk however many men it would take to subdue him. As Your Grace wishes, the Riverlands Lord murmured, his heavy eyes fixed on John. He turned his attention to his father, who was stood next to him. Father will take the bulk of our forces, the northern forces including the remaining lords, up towards the main gate. Once the gate is burning, the cavalry should charge it first. Father nodded. The gate is big enough that we should be able to get through 10 abreast with ease. What of archers? Mage Mormont asked. They will hear our approach or see their gate burning and they will take up arms. She paused and glanced at him. A small smile twisted her lips when she read his expression. I see. Rob will enter through the east gate, he said, pushing forward the Riverlands figures on the map. He will take all the Riverlands troops, minus the 250 under the command of Great Jon and Lord Root, and wait for any fleeing men. You will take care of the East Gate? Roose Bolton asked, his voice quiet as always and eyes fixed with interest on Jon. Yes. And once the battlements and the gate are done, Winter will land, and I will join you fighting on the ground. She will take the skies again. Are you sure that is wise, Your Grace? He glanced in the direction of where the question had come from but could not tell who had spoken. I will not help my armies breach the gates and then sit on Dragonback and watch men die for me, he replied, his voice sharper than he had intended. And I will not use Winter to burn Lannister men in a keep where innocent small folk, soldiers and Lady Went are held. Harrenhal is large, but it is not so large I can let Winter lose her fames inside those walls and be sure that innocent would not burn. No one speaks, and so, he continued, get some rest, my lords. He stayed in his tent for hours after listening to the sound of the army forming up, as quietly as they could, padding on the joins of the plates to try and muffle the sound they made, before they split off into the woods under the command of Robb and his father. Then he turned inwards and felt for his bond with Winter and gave it a slight tug, smiling when he felt her anticipation quiver through it and her confirmation she was ready. His eyes skimmed over the map one last time. Harrenhal was huge, at least 3 times as large as Winterfell, but the sizable Godswood, stables and every other part of the monstrous keep meant that the sheer size of the grounds the castle covered was at least 5 times as large as Winterfell. Its walls towered over everything for miles, going so high into the air, and so smooth and straight, that they were impossible to climb. It was formidable. It was pure hubris. Aemon had told him often of the hubris of men, how it was, often, their greatest weakness. And staring at Harrenhal, earlier that day, hundreds of feet in the air and hidden behind cloud, he had well believed it. In daylight, with what they believed to be 5,000 Lannister troops behind its walls, it would be impossible to sack even with an army of 200,000. Which was precisely why they were going to take the castle tonight. Interlude, 298 AC, Aemon Targaryen. You're a Targaryen. He inclined his head but kept his eyes fixed on the spoon in his hand, now shaking slightly, as he directed it towards his mouth. Once he has swallowed the porridge, lumpy and sad as it was, and it became clear that Tyrion Lannister isn't going to speak any further, he sighed. I am. Your brother was Aegon V. Targaryen. He was. The man next to him fell into silence. Then he shifted slightly on his chair and angled himself towards Aemon so that Aemon had no choice but to turn as well. He was tired, he had only spoken to his nephew for the first time the day before, and he had not slept much that night. He wanted to be left alone, but he had a feeling that Tyrion Lannister had something on his mind. I used to dream of owning a dragon, the other man said, once he was certain he had Aemon's attention. As all boys do. One of the few good things about my sister's marriage to Robert Baratheon was the day before their wedding, Tyrion replied, as though Aemon had not just tried to end their conversation prematurely. Everyone was busy, and it was so easy to slip away from the guards my father had placed on me to stop me getting into trouble. Tyrion paused as though steeling himself and then sighed. I dreamed of dragons long after I knew I should not. And so, what was I to do in King's Landing? Why, of course, hunt for the dragon skulls. I had hoped they would still be in the throne room, but, alas, my future good brother had them removed. So, I headed to the cellars. I spent all day there. You know, the teeth of Balerion were said to be as long as swords, but I looked. The root, as with our own teeth, was buried deep into the bone. His teeth must have been as tall as I. He smiled, despite himself, because although Tyrion is trying to appear clumsy and silly, he can see through the man's smoke and mirrors. They were fearsome beasts. Why did you come here? You are getting to the point, I see, he replied, turning back to his bowl and taking another sip of stew to give himself time to compose his reply. I suppose I thought it the safest place for me and my family, at the time. Your younger brother became king. He did. The throne was yours by rights. I swore a vow. Are all men of the Night's Watch as loyal to the vows they swear? The good ones. You must have seen many men though, over the years. Wait, how long have you been here? Over 70 years, he murmured. Nearly 80. I am sorry. That caught his attention. What for, Lord Tyrion? "It is a long time to be in such a place," Lord Tyrion replied after a beat. "This is not a place I would wish to spend a moon, let alone nearly 80 years. It is a curious thing, but that is all." He could not help but smile very briefly. "It has had its downsides, but that is life. There are good times and bad. Good men and bad men. Have you known many men who have resented their vows?" "Many. Jon Snow will be one of them, if he takes his vows. I told him as much last night." He did not reply. "He cannot be allowed to swear to the Watch," Tyrion Lannister said eventually, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you spoke to him last night. I cannot say I know the boy, but he deserves better. I know you must have no love for my house nor for me, but I would ask that if you are able, you try and convince him. I tried last night, but I am afraid I did more harm than good." Tyrion was on his feet by the time Aemon was able to compose a reply to what the man has said, and, even frail, old and hunched in as Aemon, he is still slightly taller than the dwarf. He stared down at the man for a few moments, and Tyrion's mismatched eyes stared back. Then, he inclined his head. "I misjudged you, Tyrion Lannister. You are not your father, are you?" "As I said to Jon Snow that all dwarfs are bastards in their father's eyes," Tyrion replied, his face blank but his eyes dull, as though the words hurt him to say. "Just because he is a bastard does not mean he belongs here. It is a good thing that fathers are rarely the best judges of their children, is it not? Some bastards rise to great heights, greater heights than their true-born peers," he murmured, turning back to his porridge. "I rather suspect you may be one of them, Lord Tyrion." Chapter 22, Folly. Chapter text. Summary: Jon takes Harrenhal. In our interlude, Aemon and Jon discuss conquerors. 299 AC, Jon Snow. Only a few fires remained on the battlements of Harrenhal when Jon took to the skies with winter hours later. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the only noises were the hooting of owls, the howling of wolves in the distance, and the gentle drops of rain as they fell on his armor. He had ridden out to the north on horseback an hour beforehand, ensuring that winter was far enough away from their encampment that no flames from it would illuminate her. She took flight. Together they had risen silently above the forest to the north of his army. Beneath him he could feel winter trembling in anticipation for the fight to come. Together they circled once over the forest, and he watched the darkness below them for any sight of his troops moving through the fields south of the encampment and towards Harrenhal. He could hear no chink of armor and no sound of boots padding on the ground. The drizzly rain that had arrived with the night had made the ground slippery and sodden, and he was immensely thankful for it. He felt the instant that Winter, with her eyes far sharper and stronger than his, spotted the troops, for the bond between them thrummed with anticipation. "Gda," he murmured. She kept her height, and they stayed steady like he requested, gently rising and falling in time with her wing beats as they hovered over the forest. In the distance, he could see the fires on the battlements remained the same. Eventually, she rumbled again, and he felt her excitement reach a crescendo. Leaning forwards he called, "Ndmagan." She dove instantly, dropping easily 50 feet in an instant as her wings tightened against her body. She only extended them again when they were mere inches above the forest, and together, they swooped only a hair's breadth over the tallest trees towards Harrenhal. Within a few wings beats she was level with the front of his advancing army, and within a few more she was ahead of them, soaring straight to the main wooden gate of Harrenhal. Dracarys. Winter obliged instantly, letting out a roar that ended in flames pouring out of her mouth and scorching the earth outside the castle in a straight line leading up to the gates. For half a second he worried he had given her the instruction too soon, but he needn't have, for her flames licked up the edges of the stone and covered the gate. There was a crack and creaking, and then she pulled up, her tail whacking into the wall as she turned at the last minute, letting out a roar of frustration as the gate failed to give. He guided her back around again in a loop. Together they skimmed across the battlements and over the fields as tightly as they could before she was once again flying over the advancing cavalry. Dracarys. She held her flames back this time, the first time she had ever actively ignored his command. He could hear troops screaming on the battlements, someone roaring orders, the clap of Winter's wings and the sound of his men advancing rapidly behind them as Winter hovered in front of the gates. Then, just as he thought that it would be too late and his men would smash into the gate before she loosed her flames, Winter whipped her head back and loosed a roar so loud that it drowned out all other noise around them. Then, flames were pouring out of her mouth. They were so hot, so ferocious, that he could feel the heat of them even from where he sat on her back. They shot straight toward the wooden gate and engulfed it, even as the first of his men began to stream underneath where she hovered. It was enough. As he watched, the gates collapsed inwards, and the first rows of troops charged through. Suddenly Winter was turning to the left, nearly dislodging him in the process. He felt her fury and her rage lurch through the bond before she let out Anther roar. His thighs burned with the effort of not toppling sideways off her, and he slipped slightly before she managed to right herself. He had barely registered what had happened before a stream of fire washed over him as she let loose another torrent of flames. Then she was soaring upwards, higher than he expected, before she turned sharply and let out another roar. He finally saw what had angered her, archers on the battlements aiming at him, rather than the soldiers pouring through the wreckage of the gate. Dracarys. She flew over the battlements, loosing her flames the whole time, toward the gate that Robb would enter through. As they approached, he realized they were later than anticipated, the delay at the first gate having cost them, and Robb and his men were lurking just outside of firing range of the archers. He quickly guided Winter in a tight circle as he flew over Robb's head so she could destroy the east gate. It took half as long as the previous gates, and he could hear roars of excitement and anticipation from the troops below him as the gate bowed in and then collapsed with an almighty groan. Ilogan, he called. He could feel her reluctance through their bond, but nonetheless she landed out of the range of the last of the archers. Instantly, he was sliding off her back and drawing Dark Sister as he ran to catch up with the last of the troops. Winter waited until he was far enough away that he would not be buffeted by the breeze from her wings before she launched herself back into the air with a fearsome roar. Behind him a howl split the air, and he smiled as Ghost appeared, running alongside him, a snarl on his lips and ears flat against his head. Ahead of him, the troops were nearly done pouring through the gates. Above him, Winter let loose another roar and bathed the battlements either side of the gate in fire. The archers she caught with her flames screamed in agony. As he watched, several fell off the battlements, frantically twisting and turning as though to put the fire on themselves out, before they landed with a thump and stopped moving. He passed under the gates at a full run, his sword raised and his eyes searching for his brother. Next to him, Ghost leaped forward with a loud howl and his eyes fixed in the distance. Jon followed him, dodging around fighting men until he caught sight of his brother, fighting alongside several others he recognized. Robb had made it further into the eastern courtyard than he had expected and was starting to be pushed back as Lannister soldiers appeared from various entrances and passageways. He glanced around as more soldiers appeared and realized, horror blooming through him, that his brother and the half-dozen men with him were about to be cut off from the bulk of the Riverlands forces. Men of the Riverlands. With me! He roared, his voice carrying loudly above the sound of metal grinding on metal and the battle cries around him. Instantly he was answered, and men around him quickly finished off their own foes and joined him as he ran through the courtyard toward his brother. For the king! Someone yelled as they fell into position beside him. It was different to last time. He had practiced day and night with Dark Sister for moons now, and she felt like an extension of his arm as he moved. She was an extension of his arm. He ducked an incoming blade and rose, swinging Dark Sister down in a wide arc straight through the body armor of the man he cleaved in two. Behind him, he heard someone swear in surprise. He kept running, eyes fixed on his brother just as more men began to swarm around him and his comrades. To Robb Stark! He called. He sliced through another man easily and then another, ducking to one side and spinning on the spot to slice across the back of the man's exposed thigh, just where the chink in his armor was. The man was falling instantly, but Jon was already turning around, turning back to where his brother was. A man appeared in front of him, but, before he could raise Dark Sister, the man was shoved to one side as Ghost rammed into him, jaws open. He glanced as he ran past, flinching slightly as Ghost savaged the man's throat, ripping it open in a spray of blood that no man could survive. He was meters away from the Lannister men who had converged on his brother then. The smooth ground underneath him, some sort of limestone, not cobbles, was slippery, and he skidded twice as he finally made it to the enemy, but his unsteady feet made no difference. So focused were the Lannister soldiers on his brother that he was able to take down two men, a slice across the back of one's neck and stabbing another straight through the throat, his sword ending up buried in the man's neck up to the pommel, before anyone realized he was there. He reached out and, as he withdrew Dark Sister, pushed the other man whose neck he had opened forwards onto the ground. He turned slightly, ducking as a sword swung over his head, and rammed himself into his attacker, sending them both stumbling backwards onto the ground. He landed on top of the man, and the man, whose head smashed into the ground with such force that John could hear the cracking of his skull even above the sound of battle, tried in vain to push him off. It was a quick slice across the man's throat with the side of Dark Sister that ended his life, and then John was pushing himself back up to his feet, spinning around to ensure no opponents had snuck up behind him. They hadn't. Around him, Riverland's men were pouring past towards where Robb had been. He squinted, moving forwards and raising Dark Sister in preparation for any blows. But he needn't have. Few Lannister troops remained in the courtyard, and the ones that were still alive were fleeing quickly, taking to the various passages and pathways that would lead them to other parts of the keep. "To me, men," he called. It took longer than he thought it would for the men to finish off the last of the Lannister soldiers and come to him, but soon all the men who had survived the breach, and had not given chase to Lannister soldiers that had managed to evade them, were clustered around him in the eastern courtyard, which, although larger in size than the one at Winterfell, was still far smaller than the one his father had breached. In the distance, he could hear his father calling orders and the Lords of the North fighting. "Groups of 5. He called once he was sure he had the attention of every man nearby. "Stick together. Kill any Lannister man you come across. If you find prisoners, ensure they remain where they are. We do not want them running around and being mistaken in the heat of the moment for Lannister men." He did not wait for their roars of approval this time. Instead, he turned and glanced at his brother and the remaining men who had pressed ahead with Robb. "With me," he said. Together, along with Ghost and Grey Wind, they took the closest passage which looked to be likely to lead them in the direction of where he could hear father's roars and the sound of battle. Ghost forced his way to the front, his paws making no noise as he prowled through the passage. It was narrow, and although 2 direwolves could have walked side by side, the men, with broad and armored shoulders, could not. He followed him, murmuring for his brother to bring up the rear with Grey Wind. The path they took slanted upwards, and grew warmer and oppressive, and it was not long before he could feel perspiration that had not been there before on his brow and under his helm. He longed to take it off and wipe away the sweat that was beginning to not just drip but pour into his eyes, but he did not. Behind him he could hear his men beginning to pant, and, just as he was about to suggest they turn back, he caught a chink of flickering light. Behind him he heard one of the men exhale. Clearly, they had seen it too. They slowed down as they approached the light. He could hear the sound of fighting closer now. Then, suddenly, he was stepping out on 2 burning battlements. He froze in place, eyes fixed on the carnage around them and below. The tunnel they had used had brought them out on the top of the battlements of the great courtyard. The courtyard below was easily as large as Winterfell in its entirety, spanning what seemed to be dozens of acres with multiple passages leading off it into other parts of the keep. On the far side of the courtyard, he could see the great hall, its great oak doors thrown wide open and at least 30 foot high, with fires blazing in what must have been 30 hearths. Yet, those fires did not burn as hot as the ones on the walls. Even 24 feet away from the closest of the fires Winter had set, he could feel the heat of them. He glanced around the battlements quickly, trying to ascertain how they could get down to aid the Stark men struggling to get through the gate. Only a few men had made it through, and they were surrounded by dozens of men. Even as he watched, another group of soldiers tried to force their way through the main gate, but over half were taken out before they reached the courtyard. He rescanned the battlements, taking in the roaring flames and the crumbling causeways. They were alone. Everyone was either dead or in the courtyard. For now, no one had noticed their presence, and it appeared that, given the noise below, no one had realized the eastern gate had been breached. "Robb, with me," he murmured. "We draw their attention to us. The rest of you, take the other set of steps. Priority is picking off the men at the edge. Make sure our men can get through." They moved swiftly, crouching low as they ran across the battlements. Behind him, he could hear and feel Grey Wind's hot breath on his back and the rumbling from Ghost that told him his direwolf itched for battle. Once they reached the dilapidated staircase that led down to the courtyard, he straightened and began to descend carefully down them, trying not to draw attention to himself, and tugged on his bond with Winter. She answered instantly, flying over the top of the great courtyard and turning the attention of the Lannister soldiers upwards in her direction and away from Jon and Robb. He leapt down the last few steps and, stumbling slightly, plunged his sword straight through the sternum of a half-dressed man. Before he had straightened, Ghost launched himself over his head, snarling, and taking down 2 soldiers at once. The noise was enough that it drew the attention of the soldiers nearby who had been facing the main gate where the Northmen were trying to breach. "For the king!" Robb roared. It was instantaneous. All the soldiers in the courtyard turned to them and, crucially, away from the Northmen trying to force their way through the gate. "Together, brother! Together!" They launched forwards before the soldiers that had turned to face them had moved. It was just like they had trained for years as children. They were a seamless unit. Despite the ground under his feet being slippery, wet from the rain but also claggy with blood, and smooth, he did not falter. He pulled Dark Sister up until the blade was level with his chest to defend against an incoming blow and, when the man faltered as his sword slid against Jon's blade, he grabbed the man around the back of the head and forced his head forwards as he pushed the blades away from him, slicing the man's own dull blade across his throat. Next to him, Robb was fighting 2 soldiers at once and holding his own ground. Jon spun, taking out another soldier with a swipe to the backs of the man's knees and, turning away as Grey Wind launched at the man to finish him off, headed towards his brother. He shoved Dark Sister through a chink in one man's armor and then pushed the man's body into the second man, giving Robb the opportunity to remove the second man's head from his shoulders with a swing of his sword. On either side of them, Ghost and Grey Wind simultaneously protected them and took out their own soldiers. He turned back to the advancing men and crouched, picking up a discarded shield, then rose quickly, ramming his shield straight into the chest of the closest man. The man stumbled backwards, and Jon jumped forward, bringing his shield to the side and slashing forward with Dark Sister, but the man was still moving backwards, so he only just nicked Dark Sister across the man's throat. Instead of the gush of blood and instant death he had expected, the man let out a blood-curdling moan and staggered further backwards, dropping his sword in the process, and flailing. He turned away from the sight and raised his shield just in time to deflect a sword that flashed across his vision. He stumbled from the strength of the unexpected blow but righted himself quickly, skipping backwards slightly and raising Dark Sister again. The man followed him and slashed at Jon's head, but he brought up his own sword and caught the blow inches from his helm. As Jon and the man struggled against each other, neither of them able to find an inch, their swords inches from their own throats, a hand appeared on the man's shoulder and pulled him back. The man stumbled, as did Jon, the unexpected release of pressure against Dark Sister making him uncoordinated for half a second, but he righted himself more quickly than the man did. As he watched, the man flailed and the hand that had pulled him away reached around to grasp the man across where his jaw was and tug him further backwards as his head was extended back. Then another hand appeared with a sword in it and swiped cleanly across the man's exposed throat. Then both hands disappeared and the man dropped to the floor, giving Jon a glimpse of the ally who had come to his aid. He took half a second to recognize the man in front of him. Then he shared a grim nod with the towering form of Great Jon Umber. "For the king!" the man bellowed, making the fighting soldiers around them jump. He pressed on, moving left, away from the path that Great Jon had cut through the ranks of Lannister soldiers to get to him and Robb. Grey Wind appeared next to him and took out a man who had half turned toward him before the man could even raise his sword. He could see Robb fighting nearby but turned away as Grey Wind launched himself in his master's direction. He charged at 2 men who had been about to disappear through one of the many passageways of the main courtyard. "Don't let them escape!" he roared. "Guard the passageways!" The 2 men he had given chase to turned and both raised their swords. Neither of them were fully armored, clearly having been asleep when the battle broke out and hurried out of their slumber to fight. One was missing his boots and another his helm. The man without a helm floundered for a moment, but the one without boots ran to meet Jon. His sword swung cleanly over the top of where Jon had been moments before as Jon ducked and weaved, turning slightly and swiping Dark Sister across the back of the man's unarmored and, therefore, exposed legs. The man let out a pitiful scream and Jon kept spinning until his shield smashed across the back of the man's head and sent him tumbling forcefully to the floor where he did not rise. He turned his attention to the last man, dimly aware that behind him the sounds of battle were beginning to die down. "Please. Don't kill me." "Drop your sword," he replied. He kept his own sword held tightly in his grasp. The man threw his sword to the side and got onto his knees. He glanced around, tightening his grip on Dark Sister as he did so and raising his shield slightly, on the off chance the man tried anything foolish, taking in the scene around him. Other than a few minor skirmishes, the battle appeared to be nearly over. "Want me to take care of this one?" Gratian asked, appearing by Jon's side as though summoned. "If there are any other prisoners, put him with them. See they are treated well. And you? My brother and I shall continue through the keep and root out any skulking men." Gratian nodded, his helm jerking slightly and bellowed, "Men. With the king." Instantly, at least a dozen Umber soldiers appeared around Jon. Gratian removed his helm and gave Jon a sharp grin at Jon's bemused expression. "Ned is dealing with a wounded mage, woman is a wretched cow, but gods, was I wrong about her presence on the battlefield? It took your father and Meja to get her away from the front lines." He grimaced. "She will live. Not as bad as it looks, they think, but it was her head, so Ned wanted someone to look at it. Old Bear will outlive all of us if her screams and demands to get back to the front line is anything to go by." He nodded. "Instruct the men who have not yet breached to search the castle in groups. I leave command of the forces to you, Gratian." Gratian bowed so deeply that it appeared half mocking, but then turned, grabbed the man on the ground and hauled him to his feet, and began bellowing orders at the men nearby even as he half dragged the defeated soldier away. "Father?" Robb asked, appearing suddenly at Jon's side. He glanced at his brother, relieved to see Robb unhurt although clearly hot. He had removed his helm and sweat was dripping down from his hair and into his eyes. As he watched, his brother swiped the back of his palm across his forehead and shoved his helm back on. "Well. Dealing with Mage Mormont?" Robb snorted. "Shall we then?" He nodded. "Tightened together," he replied. He turned to look at the men nearby. "Keep your eyes open and if you see anything strange, alert everyone else. These passages are likely narrow, we cannot afford to be taken by surprise." He took the lead, heading towards the passage that the two Lannister soldiers had been about to go down. He dropped his shield outside and instead used two hands to grasp Dark Sister. Then he sucked in a deep breath and strode away from the burning fires in the courtyard. He could hear Robb instructing the other men to fall in behind him and then the sound of his brother telling Grey Wind and Ghost to go and find their father. The group walked single file in silence for several moments and, as it began to grow darker in the passageway, he worried they would lose the light behind them before fresh light appeared ahead of them. He was wrong though. Long before the light from the flames in the courtyard faded, he could see flickering flames ahead. Then he could hear voices. "A dozen, at least," he murmured to the man behind him. He fell silent but kept walking, listening as his words were echoed back. He kept going forwards. Eventually, when the light ahead began to fill the whole exit of the passage instead of being a speck on the horizon, he stopped walking. "We move fast and quick." He didn't wait for a response but instead strode forward, tightening his grip around Dark Sister. He burst out of the passageway quickly, not taking time to let his eyes adjust to the bright lights before he was throwing himself to one side and towards a startled voice that had yelled, "Stark men!" He parried a sword from the man who had yelled and returned his own blow, aiming once more for the chink between helm and armor. But the other man's blade met his, catching Dark Sister on the edge and sending it spinning away. He blinked, surprised at the man's quick reflexes. This was no average soldier, this was definitely a noble with formal training, but kept going. Their blades met and fell away again a dozen times, but neither of them gained traction. For every move forward that Jon took, the other man parried his blows easily. He was faster than Jon, unarmed, clearly taken unawares by their nighttime attack. Around him, he could hear his brother heavy breathing, because he knew Robb and he knew what his brother sounded like when he was getting fatigued, and the moans and groans of fallen men. The smell of blood hung in the air, heavy and claggy, and burning filled his nose. The man he was fighting was good. Very good. Well trained and precise. But he was unoriginal, using moves that Jon had trained as a boy. That every boy trained when they were new to learning the art of swordplay. Basic moves. It made him predictable. He favored his left, leaning heavily on it when he lunged, to the point of being slightly unbalanced, and always tried to land a heavy blow whenever Jon spun away. He smiled to himself. The next time he spun away, he threw himself onto the floor and kicked out at the other man, knocking his legs out from under him. The man's sword went tumbling away as his blade kept going in the direction that Jon knew it would go. As the man fell, Jon was already moving, stumbling back to his feet and grasping Dark Sister in two hands to plunge it down, but the man grabbed at his legs and tugged them out from underneath. He landed heavily, only just managing to stop himself from smashing his head into the ground by holding it at an awkward angle, and felt the air leave his lungs for a moment. In the second it took him to orientate himself, the man he had been fighting had lurched forwards and was clambering toward him. He sat up, ignoring the flashing behind his eyes, as his head spun, and let go of Dark Sister, letting it rest on the floor. Instead, he moved his right arm back and then smashed his fist straight into the other man's face. He watched as the man rocked back and took a brief moment to thank the gods that half the soldiers he had faced that night had been poorly armored, or not armored at all. Jon grimaced as blood poured out of the man's nose, and lurched further forwards, following the other man until he was hovering over him. Then he swiped his hand across the man's face, moving the other man's hands out of the way, and rammed his fist back into the man's face again, wincing slightly at the crack of bone he could hear above the sudden quiet in the room. The man wiggled underneath him, bucking up to try and dislodge him even as he howled. But Jon smashed his fist down again. The man's head snapped to one side, and he fell silent. Still sitting atop his fallen foe, he heaved out a deep breath and then glanced up. Around the room, he could see men clad in umber colors removing weapons from men who had surrendered or who had died. In the corner of the room, several men sat stripped of their any armor they had managed to put on before the surprise attack and with faces pressed against the wall. Nearby, Robb was watching him, his helm tucked under one arm and an unreadable expression on his face. He did a final sweep of the room and then removed his own helm, tossing it onto the floor. He rose to his feet, pushing himself off the body beneath him and stumbling slightly. "What was that?" Robb asked, his voice quiet and bare discernible above the soldiers talking nearby, the crackling fires in the room they were in and the roar of fighting nearby. "I was arrogant," he replied. "It shan't happen again. ****. They left 3 of their men guarding the bound and gagged Lannister soldiers, and several of their injured own, and pressed on. The room they had arrived in had clearly been some sort of storeroom decades before, but now was being used as a barracks, and so Jon was not worried about leaving so few men behind. It was a much smaller group that left the makeshift barracks, only 7 plus Jon and Robb. Robb went first, opening the only other door in the room and then launching himself into the hallway beyond, sword high. Then he dropped it. Empty. Jon followed, flanked by the other soldiers. He glanced up and down the hallway they had arrived in. In the distance he could still hear the muffled sound of fighting nearby. "We go this way," he murmured, gesturing away from the sound of fighting. "If they have fled further into the keep, we must find them." He and Robb moved down the passageway together, the rest of the soldiers falling in behind them. They walked in silence for a few minutes, pausing every now and then to open doors off the passageway, both to check for any prisoners but also to ensure no Lannister soldiers were hidden within and waiting to spring a trap on them once they had walked past. But they found no one. He stopped walking as the sound of fighting met his ears. Next to him Robb chewed on his lip and jerked his head ahead, towards the sound of the fighting. At the end of the corridor was a tall door, easily 7 foot high, and behind which he could hear swords meeting each other and the roars of men as they fought. "When we breach that door, you two stay here. Kill any Lannister soldiers that attempt to flee." The 2 men he had gestured at nodded and broke away from the group slightly. He moved ahead of Robb and started walking again. Once they were close to the door, he grasped both hands tightly around Dark Sister and nodded at his brother. Robb leaned past him and shoved the door open, pushing it so hard that it smashed into the wall the other side and then began to move back as though to close again. But Jon was already pressing forwards. It was the Great Hall. Dozens of fires roared in the hearths and around the room. Northmen and Riverlands men battled with Lannister soldiers. Most of the Lannister soldiers had their backs to them and were facing the other way, clearly where Jon's forces had breached. He squinted. Gods! Harren's folly indeed. The hall was huge, even bursting in halfway down like Jon and Robb had. There was still easily 100 feet between them and the closest Lannister soldiers who were desperately trying to push Jon's forces back. He glanced around as he crossed the threshold, noting that this room had clearly been used as some sort of operation room. Documents were resting on tables nearby and there was a huge map hung on a wall. The papers, Rob. He called. Secure the papers. He heard his brother yelling that he would, but John was already turning to meet the first man who was racing in their direction. The soldiers he had brought with him roared forward to meet the man, killing him before he could get within 2 meters of John. He lowered Dark Sister in surprise and glanced at the backs of the soldiers who were racing to meet more Lannister troops. Then he followed. His first opponent was a lightly armored man with an axe in one hand and a dagger in another. He froze for half a second, remembering the wildlings in the woods in the northern mountains, but the movement of the axe bearing down on him, aiming straight in the center of his head, had him moving. He darted to the side and turned back to face his opponent, bringing Dark Sister down in a wide arch to try and force his opponent to raise the axe to stop the blow, which he did. But then the man also brought up the dagger as well. Instead of using it to help push back against the sword, the man whipped it up and over Dark Sister and put all his weight down on it, pushing John's sword down. The man's axe rose then as the dagger kept pushing his sword down, and the man swung the axe widely, towards John's head. He ducked and launched himself to the side, yanking Dark Sister away from the dagger and the force of the man's body weight, twisting back around to meet the man again. He was ready before the man was and quickly lunged forward, using his own weight to force Dark Sister straight through the man's armor. He turned away instantly and was met with a wave of Lannister soldiers charging his way, clearly desperate to get between the soldiers John had been fighting with and John, to isolate him from any help. He moved backwards, towards where he thought Rob had gone to secure the papers. "With me," he called. The soldiers around him finished their opponents and glanced at him and then around to see what had caused him to yell. Instantly they were moving towards him. They made to force him behind them, but he held firm. Together. ****. You wanted to see me, Great Jon. He was in the great courtyard, the same one that they had breached hours before, for the first time since the fighting had stopped. The sun was fully risen in the sky now, bathing the courtyard in brilliant warm sunshine, a far cry from the rain of the night before, but Jon still felt cold. The sweat from the night before had dried onto his skin and, having removed his armor hours before, the gentle breeze was making him shiver slightly. Great Jon Umber turned to look down at him, eyes flashing with anger. Then, he gave the man next to him a harsh shove which made the man stagger forwards, trip over the irons and drop to the floor with a sickening crunch, indicating something had broken. But the man did not cry or make any noise of discomfort. "Sir Kevan Lannister," Great Jon said. Then he turned his head slightly to the side and spat on the floor. "Took down Eddard Karstark and Alysanne Mormont after he and his men surrendered. I'd have come sooner, but we had to stop Mage from killing him with her bare hands." He sucked in a breath. "Mage, Rickard. Your father sees to them." "Send for them," he murmured. "Your Grace?" Great Jon asked, turning to look at him fully now and ignoring the man clad in irons on the floor. "Our way is the old way. I will not keep a man alive when he butchered my father's bannermen and friends of houses Stark and Targaryen after he had surrendered, and the battle was over, but it is Mage and Rickard who lost their children." Great Jon gave him a long look before he nodded. "Shall I take him with me?" He shook his head. "I can manage one shackled prisoner." "Very well." Jon watched him go, unable to stop the sickening feeling in his stomach spreading. He needed a prisoner. Prisoners were currency in a war, and now he was going to have to let Mage or Rickard take vengeance for their dead children. "Going to kill me, boy?" He shook his head, not even turning to look at Kevan Lannister. "No. A coward then, just like your father." "The man who passes the sentence must swing the sword," he murmured. "But it was not my child you killed, Sir Kevan. The choice belongs to Lady Mormont and Lord Karstark, not me. ****. You would have been wise to hostage Sir Kevan," father murmured, his eyes fixed on the pyres that had just been lit by soldiers on the fields outside of Harrenhal. "Lord Tywine will not take this slight well. He killed a son and a daughter of the North in cold blood, father," he replied, his own voice quiet, lest the lords nearby hear them. "The decision was not mine to make. Lord Karstark and Lady Mormont would never have accepted Sir Kevan remaining as a hostage, to potentially walk free again when this war is over, after what he did to their children." "You are right," father acknowledged. "But there will be consequences for this, Jon. When word reaches Lord Tywine of what happened here, I fear what he will do." "I I know. I would have kept him alive, if I could have. Prisoners give us leverage against the Lannisters. I would have a whole dungeon full of Lannisters to try and force Tywin's hand. But it was not my choice. Father nodded and made to open his mouth but was cut off by the arrival of Robb, who slid himself into position between Jon and Father with one smooth step. They are ready, brother. He nodded, turning slightly to glance down the row to see Lady Mormont and Lord Karstark take their own positions nearby. When their eyes met his, he inclined his head and together they broke away from the group gathered outside of Harrenhal and moved towards the only pyre yet to be lit. It was further away from the castle than the others, and far larger. Easily 5 meters across, big enough that Alysanne Mormont and Eddard Karstark could lay without touching. Once he was close enough, he ran his eyes over their prone bodies. He had not known either of them well, as he had spent much of his time with the lords rather than their heirs and children, but Robb had been fond of both of them. The gash across Alysanne Mormont's neck was thick and ugly, exposing bone, and he ripped his eyes away as soon as he fixed on it. Instead turning his attention to the black cloak around her shoulders and the green bear emblazoned on her armor. Her face was firm and angry, even in death she was a sight to behold. A few feet away, Eddard Karstark looked much like his father, gaunt with scraggly hair and an unkempt beard, with the same black and white armor that his brothers had worn in the battle. On the other side of the pyre, Winter shifted slightly and raised her head. Next to him, Lady Mormont and Lord Karstark barely glanced at her, instead their eyes remained fixed on their children. Lady Mage, Lord Rickard. He murmured. I have asked already, but I ask again, are you sure this is what you wish? I can spare the men to take your children's bodies north. My daughter died for you, Jon Snow, Mage Mormont said, her eyes still fixed on her daughter's body. As Jon watched, she leaned forward and pushed some of Alysanne's hair out of her face, a surprisingly tender move from the woman. She would have considered this to be the greatest honor. Burn her. Let her be the first to receive such an honor. Lord Rickard grumbled, his voice thick and heavy. We cannot send them north. A pyre lit by dragon fire, by his king's dragon, is how my Eddard would have wished to go. Very well, he replied. He took a step back from the pyre and waited until Mage and Rickard had done likewise. On the other side of the pyre, Winter rose to her full height and extended her neck until her head was hovering over the pyre. Then she took a step back and retreated. Dracarys, he murmured. The roar Winter let out was the loudest he had yet heard, and next to him he felt both his companions flinch. Winter whipped her head back as she roared, and then she extended her neck forwards, smoke curling at the edges of her mouth as the flames built inside her. Then, seconds later, red and white flames poured from her, arching up and over the pyre and igniting the oil on it. She held the flame for an age, until nothing more than a small trickle was pouring out of her mouth, before she snapped her jaws shut. Interlude, 298 AC, Aemon Targaryen. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if the dance had never occurred? He swallowed the spoonful of broth he had just taken into his mouth carefully and then scooped up another mouthful as he bought time to compose an answer to his nephew's question. Not really, he answered eventually. Truly. Truly, he replied, unable to stop himself from smiling slightly at his nephew's startled expression. But sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we had never have lost our dragons. Tell me, Jon whispered, his voice half asleep but still audibly excited. Had it been anyone else, Aemon would have thought it an order. But from Jon it sounded more like a wishful desire, no, a plea, to talk about paths not trodden. He put his spoon down and gazed thoughtfully at the dragon who was nestled on his lap. As though sensing his gaze on her, she opened her white eyes and chirped quietly, like a baby bird would. He sighed and turned to look at his bowl, spying a small bit of meat, and carefully scooped it out with his fingers before he presented it to her. She cocked her head to the side for a moment. Then she lunged forward, mouth open, and snapped it from his fingertips. In less than half a second it was gone, then she was crawling up his body to rest her head on the table. He watched as she gazed mournfully up at him and, when he shook his head, she snorted and closed her eyes. But she did not move. She acts like a puppy, Jon said, sounding more alert this time. Like Ghost did when he used to beg for scraps. She is growing. I dare say she would eat every piece of meat in Castle Black if she could only escape this room, he replied. Do you think she needs more? He shook his head. No. She grows quickly but her legs and wings are still small, it would be wise not to overfeed her whilst she is too young. Like a puppy, as you said. Jon leaned back against the side of the bed and gazed thoughtfully at him. I never really thought much about raising a dragon, and I cannot help but think if more people knew how difficult it was, far fewer children would dream of having them. Did you ever dream of dragons? I dreamed of being a conqueror, of being a great warrior. I wanted to find honor and glory. But I did not dream of dragons. Aegon. Daeron. The young dragon, he remarked. Why did you admire him? On his chest, the dragon twitched slightly and withdrew her head from the table and turned to look at Jon as though she was likewise interested in hearing what he thought. I admired many of the great heroes of old, Jon admitted, his voice going slightly higher, betraying his embarrassment at his boyhood dreams. Aemon the Dragon Knight. King Daeron. Riam Redwine. Florian the Fool. Even Sir Arthur Dane. But why? Jon did not speak for a moment and Aemon watched, a dull flush creeped up his nephew's face. Because of what they stood for. Their good deeds. What they achieved. I see, he remarked. Tell me of Daeron. He phrased the request like a question deliberately, hoping that it might encourage his nephew to open up to him. He was a conqueror, Jon said several minutes later. As Aemon watched, Jon opened and closed his mouth several times before he whispered, and he died. And he died, he said simply. He died when he was 8 and 10. Barely a few name days older than you. He did not take advice of his hand, his allies, his family nor his friends. He was foolish and he was arrogant. He thought he was king and could do as he wished. He thought bringing Dorne to heel, finishing what Aegon, Visenya and Rhaenys started, would make him a true Targaryen king. That it would make him memorable. And he is. Young boys across Westeros worship him for being a true knight, a conqueror and the first man to unite the Seven Kingdoms. Old men see him for what he was, a fool. And he died, Jon. Tens of thousands of men died for him. They died for their king's arrogance and their king's greed. War is not a game, nephew, and too often the young view their heroes as infallible. They are not. Daeron could have been a good king. A great king. But we shall never know. You always manage to turn our conversations into lessons, Uncle Jon remarked. But there was no bite to his voice, just wry amusement. What does make a good king? Doing the right thing, for the right reason. A king can be remembered for many things. But tell me, is it better to have been a great king who ruled in times that were mostly of peace, took the advice of his advisors, and knew what his lords and ladies wished for and who is largely forgotten in the histories, like my nephew, or to have been a conqueror who will be remembered for generations to come and yet who brought nothing but strife, misery and suffering to thousands, and ignored the advice of his advisors and did not know his lords and ladies, like Daeron? Can a man not be both a conqueror and a man of peace? A man can be both. But if a man must choose, a wise man would pick the latter. Glory is found on the field of battle, but there is nothing more glorious than knowing you have secured your family's legacy for another generation and knowing you have the love and respect of your people, lords, ladies and small folk alike. Chapter 23, Forgive. Chapter text. Summary, Catelyn arrives at Harrenhal and Montfort Valerian arrives on Dragonstone. Meanwhile, Doran speaks to Arianne. Notes, 2 quick points. First, to say, and this covers my other 3 stories, a huge thanks for all the kudos and comments and engagement on my stories. I love knowing that you all enjoy my work. I am trying to keep on top of all the comments and do my best to reply to all, but sometimes it takes more time than I would like. If you do have any questions, comments or views, please do share and know that I will read them and respond as soon as I am able. Second, as soon as Perennial has finished, about 8 chapters left, I think /hope. But I've said that before, so who knows, I will be turning more of my focus to this story to bring it to a close. 299 AC, Jon Snow. I had no choice, he said, breaking the silence that had settled between him and Robb as they stood outside the main gates of Harrenhal and gazed at the last of the smouldering pyres. The sun was low in the sky, barely risen, and the bright red light made the flames look even brighter. Beyond the burning pyre Winter slept and, clustered around her like moths to a flame, Grey Wind and Ghost slept. They made a strange group, 2 direwolves and a dragon. Yet, as Jon watched, Grey Wind rose to his feet and let out a languid stretched, then turned around and threw himself back down, inching closer towards Winter's side. It was nearly a week since the battle, and the rain that had drizzled before, during and after the taking of Harrenhal had long gone. The largest of the pyres, the one that the soldiers who had died fighting for Jon had rested on, was the last one smoking. His eyes rested on it for a moment, and he could not hope but wish it would stop burning soon. As long as it burned, he felt restless, as though he was still fighting. "I know. Why does it feel like I did? Do you ask as my brother or as my king?" Robb asked, glancing away from the direwolves and toward Jon. "Your brother." Robb sighed. "You feel like you made a mistake, because you know what will happen next. Tywin Lannister will use this,